異なった倫理的観点から正義の是正に目覚め、遺骨を返還する責任を果たさなければ未来の研究はありえないと考えている研究者もいます。先ほど社会的子孫という考えを示しましたが、先祖という言葉を拡大解釈し、同じように社会的関与を加えるとすれば、子孫の責任は先達の残した負の遺産にどう対処するかという課題も含まれることになります。負の遺産への対処とは、先達たちの過去の行為に対する責任を自ら引き受けるという意味で、アカウンタビリティと言ってもいいでしょう。責任とは、それぞれの集団が傷ついてしまった現在を修復しようという共通の目標を表す言葉になっているのです。遺骨返還は修復的正義を構成します。シンポジウムの精神の中心には、この責任という考えがあります。責任の感覚を呼び起こすのは、過去が過ぎ去ってなどいないからです。今日登壇してくださるチップ・コルウェルさんのご発表は、亡霊に疲れた私たちというタイトルです。亡霊は秩序だった時間の進行を止め、今を生きる人たちに対し過去の不正義を語り、その是正を求めます。私は遺骨返還も亡霊の登場と似たところがあると感じてきました。現在から未来に向けた秩序だった時間の流れ、すなわち進歩という考えにより、消されてしまった過去を記憶し直し、別の未来の在り方を模索するように促すからです。つまり遺骨返還も亡霊も植民地主義に起因する問題を解決するために、私たちに未来を脱植民地化することを求めるというわけです。次のスライドをお願いします。第2に、シンポジウムの精神には、修復的正義の実践として返還による人間性の回復という発想もあります。植民地主義的権力関係を正当化する人種概念に立脚したちは、膨大な遺骨を世界のミュージアムや大学に集積しました。それらの遺骨の返還を求める子孫たちに対し、ここ日本でもさまざまな抵抗があることは皆さんもご承知の通りです。しかし、ハレアロハ・アヤウさんが詳しくお話してくださると思いますが、近年法的強制力がないにもかかわらず、ミュージアムが自主的にそれら植民地主義の負の遺産を返還し始めています。ミュージアムが人類共通の知的遺産と位置づけてきた遺骨の返還に応じているという事実は、脱植民地化の一例と言えるでしょう。アヤウさんはあるインタビューの中で、遺骨返還を通したミュージアムは再び人間性を回復する機会を手にしていると述べています。田島さん、クレインさんご夫妻も、遺骨返還を拒絶する研究者たちは、子孫となる共同体の歴史的トラウマを継続しているだけではなく、自らの人間性をも否定し続けていると主張しています。遺骨返還は返還を求めてきた子孫たちだけではなく、遺骨を保管し続けてきたミュージアムや返還を拒む研究者にとっても、自らの人間性を回復する機会になる可能性を宿しているわけです。ここで私が強調したいのは、アカウンタビリティ、責任、修復的正義などは近代出自の概念と見られがちですが、それは世界の先住民が先祖への責任として口にする思想でもあるという事実です。傷ついた世界をいかに修復するか、歴史的トラウマをどう乗り越えるかという脱植民地化の諸課題は近代の課題であると同時に、責任という先住民たちの自身の思想によって取り組みがすでになされているわけです。例えばハワイ先住民カナカマオリにはそのような責任を果たすためにクレアナという言葉があるそうです。ところでミュージアム側が遺骨返還にもうやめなきゃだめね。ところでミュージアムが遺骨返還に応じるようになった理由は、近年問題化してきた遺骨を厄介払いしたいからだといううがった見方もあります。ミュージアムは先住民の流星という世界的潮流に差を差し、啓蒙装置としての自らの社会的機能を再び正当化しようとしているだけなのかもしれません。だからミュージアムの脱植民地が進んでいると判断するのは時期尚早だというわけです。しかし私は楽観主義者です。返還により構築された先住民とミュージアムとの関係性は終着点ではなく、新たな出発点にはなるのではないかと考えています。で、第3に次のスライドをお願いします。当たり前すぎることかもしれませんが、学知は変化し、脱植民地化に寄与する力を内包しているということです。琉球遺骨返還では、京都大学が政治書を書き、 琉球の人たちの人間性を否定し続けています。さらに、自らを地の管理者として位置づけ、遺骨をサンプルと呼び、将来新たな分析指標の到来が予測される、そういう理由で継続保管を主張している自然人類学者もいます。それらの自然人類学者の発想は、社会における研究倫理の進展を無視した科学至上主義に過ぎません。だからこそ民主化しようとする社会では、学士全体が否定的な評価を受けかねなくなってしまうわけです。そんな状況下を忘れてはならないのは、学士のイメージは社会性の欠落した探求だけではに限定されるではないということです。これからご登壇していただくマイケル・ブレイキーさんとサブリナ・アガウラさんのお二人は、学問が敵ではないということを示してくれます。マイケル・ブレイキーさんは北米先住民だけではなく、隷属化されたアフリカ人の末裔となる子孫の人たちにも研究を進めてきました。歴史から排除された過去を物語るために、それらの末裔たちと共に何が一体できるのかというコミットメントからブレイキーさんは研究を出発しています。研究者たちの専門的知識は、それらの子孫たちとの間における信頼関係、共感、そして目的の共有を通して生命を持つことになります。研究は共同体の希望を実現するためにあるというわけです。サブリナ・アガワルさんは、先住民が遺骨が大量に保管されている大学の自然史博物館の歴史と、インドからレッドマーケットを介し、世界中に輸出された骨格標本の存在に触発され、死の暴力、ネクロバイオレンスについて研究を進めています。報道によれば、日本でも2019年、東京都足立区にある骨格標本業者の事務所兼住宅から約500体の人骨標本が発見されました。アガワルさんは、先住民に対する入植者植民主義的暴力だけではなく、市場を介したグローバルに拡大していく死者に対する植民主義的暴力をも批判する学問として、生物考古学を再創造しているというわけです。そのような作業を通して、子孫となる共同体とともに共同作業への道筋が初めて開かれるというわけです。もう時間がないので最後なんですけれども、最後は実は、次のスライドお願いします。第4は実は対話の重要性です。対話という言葉は当初ですね、このシンポジウムのタイトルには含まれていませんでした。しかし、今回のシンポジウムに共催していただいている二来カナイヌ会の皆様と話し合った結果、誕生したという意味で対話の産物となっています。亀谷さん、玉口さん、中村さん、伊佐さん、松村さんをはじめ二来カナイの皆さんとは約3年間、私はさまざまなシンポジウムで同席してきました。で、その中で、分かったことはですね、対話ということがですね、次行きましょう。で、もう一つだけ言わせてください。それは、もう一つ対話とともにですね、大切な学びとして記憶に残るのは、実は具志堅高松さんのこのガンマフェアの活動です。具志堅さんは、琉球では社会的子孫の責任と遺族ではないが遺骨収集を行うという社会的哀悼の上海史、遺骨返還と、それから、具志堅さんが行ってきた遺骨収集活動とかですね、ここでは隣り合わせになっているということを私は教えてもらいました。今日の島言葉によるシンポジウムのタイトルなんですけれども、学びとそれを可能にしてきた対話の大切さを表現しているという意味で、一番最初に私が提示した、シンポジウムのタイトルよりもですね、より簡潔で素晴らしいタイトルになったと考えております。時間が来ているそうです。私のタイムキーパーはここにいて、もうやめろと言っています。というわけで、ここで終わろうと思います。ありがとうございました。それでは次の登壇者の方に登壇していただきたいと思います。まず、第1番目の登壇者として、ニール・タシマさんと、キャスリン・クレインさん、ご夫妻による、人間性の共有を作り上げることというタイトルでご発表をお願いしたいと思います。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Hello, I'm Niel Tashima, a Japanese American who traces his roots to the 1890s in California, and before that to Japan. I grew up in a small Japanese American farming community in Central California, and when I was 5 or 6 years old, my parents told me that each time they went to see my grandparents, who only spoke Japanese, I should say, Tadaima, I'm home, before saying anything else to them. Usually my grandmother would say, "Okaeri," or "welcome home." It was through that simple greeting that I began to learn home was a special place that would always welcome me and accept me as I was. Over the years, I have returned to that simple concept to begin understanding different words, using it as an anchor so that I could understand how other people see their world and how they are anchored through language and culture to that place and time. This is also where my understanding of a shared sense of humanity begins. Having had the privilege of working with communities across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, throughout the United States and places in Africa and Europe, I have continued to understand people and their cultures through their view of home and how they construct their sense of humanity. So we begin our conversation with the concept of home and a shared humanity. I am trained as a psychological anthropologist with a 4-decade professional history serving as one of the managing partners in LTG Associates. I am also a full professor, professional track in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Michigan.
Hello, I'm Cathleen Crain, an Anglo-American woman or Gaijin.
Please, Michael. Yeah, close, please.
Okay. Give me a stand. Okay. I'm Cathleen Crain, an Anglo-American woman or Gaijin from Mofan, Ha'oli, depending on the context. Trained in Canada as a physical and biological and medical anthropologist in a strong 4-field school, I've spent the past 40 years plus working on complex issues of health and wellness with communities and with program planners and policymakers in the U.S. and internationally. I am always an outsider in my work and must continually learn the perspectives, values, and priorities of those with whom I work in order to be useful in addressing challenging issues. Better? Here we go. I am the other managing partner in LTG Associates and a full professional track in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Maryland, College Park. We are grateful to Dr. Yoshinova Ota, Emeritus Professor, Kyushu University, and Principal Investigator and Conference Organizer, assisted by members of his research team that has brought us all together. We are grateful to the Ryukyuan people with whom we have met for their graciousness in speaking with us and sharing their important experience and views. Candidly, thoughtfully, arigato. We are speaking and writing from a particular American perspective, so please forgive our generalizations and lack of knowledge. Please also forgive our lack of cultural depths about the Ainu, Japanese, and Ryukyuan cultures and histories. What we bring to this conversation is history, both with the struggles to develop ethics statements and in developing respectful exchanges and relationships between those in official power and communities.
We've been involved with the development of the last 2 ethnic statements for the American Anthropological Association, as well as the National Association for the Practice of Anthropology. We have more than a 30-year history contributing to the professional statements of both organizations. We have worked with communities across the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and to some extent Africa and Europe, as well as across the United States. We also have worked with more than 35 ethnic communities in the United States, and our area of specialty is addressing complex issues and conditions clearly the issue of the rights to and repatriation of human remains is a complex issue. We are also special advisors to the American Anthropological Association's Commission for the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains. In Japan and for overseas Japanese populations, these are traditional words, tadaima and okaeri, belonging that mark belonging. I am home, called out upon returning home, and the acknowledging the response of okaeri that is welcome home. Why are we talking about home? First, home is where your people are and where you belong. In the best of cases, home is where you are accepted and understood, where you can count on others to respect and protect you and your humanity. A real home is not a place, not a space, not a dwelling, but a circumstance in which you know that you are welcomed and understood. Many people never have a home and live outside that comfort and acceptance. They live in houses, they dwell with others, but do not experience the welcome of home. We ask, if we are not accepted, how is their humanity acknowledged and honored? Where is the relationship to others acknowledged? We're going to explore the idea that the Ryukyuan people have been denied the fullness of home and the respect for their humanity in past through the denial of their ability to have agency over the remains of their ancestors. We also believe that the current discord, whether acknowledged or not, the humanity of the researchers who deny the humanity of descendants by refusing to acknowledge their rights to and agency over the remains of the ancestors is being damaged. In this paper and presentation, we hope to identify some potential means to move beyond the current discord in ways that benefit all, and good points to the future, where everyone is welcomed home. How can everyone know that they have come home where they will be welcomed? Okaeri, am I home?
Next slide. There are a number of issues. There are a small number of issues that embody nearly universal cultural significance. Responsibility for the care, treatment, and placement of the remains of the dead holds great power and significance in cultures globally. In many cultures, the dead, and by extension their bodily remains, are not simply dead, gone, and forgotten, but rather they are treated as part of the chain of history, a link to the afterlife, an embodiment of the living spirit in the world, active in the lives of family and community. It has been reported that the Ainu, Japanese, and Ryukyuan cultures share in this general reverence and care for the dead and avoid behaviors that would create disrespect and therefore harm. In conflict, the maltreatment of human remains and depriving people of control over their remains is a way to demonstrate dominance and superiority and to inflict harm. The 1949 Geneva Convention, to which Japan is a signatory, specifically addresses allowing the search for the dead, the care for the remains, recognizing the significance of human remains to the people, to their home, to their families, to their communities. In Japan, as we understand it, descendant Ainu and Ryukyuan people have asked for the return of skeletal and related materials. For a variety of reasons, the materials have not been repatriated. This has spawned legal challenges and continued the acrimony and harm, especially to descendant communities. Next slide. Professionally, anthropology as a discipline has moved over the past several decades to a vision that not only emphasizes the importance of a scientific perspective, but also the engagement of descendant communities in the process of determining the ethical treatment of their dead and cultural artifacts. Walker, in an early discussion, outlines 3 principles derived from ethics statements of a variety of organizations when working with human remains. 1, human remains should be treated with dignity and respect. 2, descendants should have the authority to control the disposition of the remains of their relatives and ancestors. And 3, owing to the importance for understanding the history of our species, the preservation of archaeological collections of human remains is an ethical imperative. This defines much of the tension between anthropologists and descendants. Descendants should have control, and conducting research and maintaining collections is imperative. Miles apart. The challenge is to find ground where descendant communities can have control of remains and where research that benefits the past and the future can be considered.
The Society for American Archaeology, citing the American Anthropological Association and the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, citing the National Association for the Practice of Anthropology, have developed statements on ethics that not only consider the concerns of the anthropologist, but directs anthropologists to consider the concerns of communities and partners. All of these statements are living documents and continue to evolve. As anthropologists, we judge the development of cultures based in part on the manner in which the dead are treated and care that has been extended to the remains and to their descendants. For those whose skeletal remains have been taken for study by scientists, they may feel severed from those relationships and the duties and responsibilities that should have been conducted by those who remain in this world. Some version of these values are likely to be found in every culture across the world. Objectification of human remains places the remains outside the realm of care and concern as humans, as people, and denying their humanity. Scientists are unlikely to be lacking reverence for their own honored dead, but may believe that the value of the scientific endeavor is paramount. While this stance is potentially understandable within that logic, it is no longer a defensible or dominant view and is engendering discord and harm, certainly to descendant communities and secondarily to the scholars and to the discipline.
Suji, what's our time?
Still more? 8 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to go faster. As noted above, from our admittedly limited understanding, the current situation is causing harm to all involved, beginning with descendant communities as our central concern. Denying descendant communities the ability to have agency over their ancestors' remains is creating enduring harm, which may transmit over generations. The denial of control or agency is also continuing or increasing discord between researchers and descendant communities. As a result of this situation and other related situations, there is discord within the anthropological community. It is diminishing the reputations of the researchers unwilling to work with descendants. Finally, whether acknowledged or not, the situation is harming the dignity and humanity of all. Some consequences of the current situation. We believe that everyone is being harmed. Descendant communities, as well as researchers, whether they recognize the harm to their own humanity or not, we believe that they are in peril of being harmed. I'm sorry, I just went off script. It appears that positions have hardened, diminishing avenues of recourse remaining to descendant communities. We suggest that there are paths that must be taken, and the Ryukyuan community has taken some of those paths. They include legal cases, new law, and seeking regulatory changes, as well as disciplinary changes that place scholars and institutions unwilling to work with descendant communities increasingly at odds with accepted international standards and practice. Importantly, the increasing divisions are likely to be limiting or foreclosing on potential collaborations among scholars and between scholars and descendant communities. Next slide.
The current situation is not fixed. And as we've noted, it will likely change, and descendant communities will have a very strong voice in how that happens. If descendant communities win through legal processes, then it is entirely possible that they will take their ancestors' remains home and ensure that they are never touched again. Should the researchers be able to prolong the endpoint, descendant communities will have to wait for the changes to occur, inflicting continuing harm and further hardening divisions. Eventually, however, remains will be returned, and it is probable that there will be little opportunity for collaborative research agendas being developed that can inform the past and can predict the future, or a different path can be developed. Next slide. We're trying to figure out what we can cut. So please forgive us. We have lots to say.
We think that there are potential benefits to researchers in changing. We also think that there will be harm if they do not change. So why should biological physical anthropologists want to change? What would be the benefit? Why would they want to give up control? The first reason for changing, and we think that this begins to forecast ideas of leverage over researchers. The first reason is to be in the vanguard in working in accordance with global professional standards for the ethical treatment of human remains. The world is going there. They can be back or they can be at the front. This will also avoid being compelled to change. This is going to change. Regulatory standards are going to change, and the settling of legal cases will force change if it isn't done voluntarily. Change could potentially bring the opportunity to negotiate a path to working with descendant communities to develop and conduct research beneficial within and beyond the remains.
Next slide. The lack of engagement by researchers with descendant communities is the key barrier. If there is no engagement, then the opportunity for change through negotiation cannot exist. Everyone should recognize that not changing will result in continuing damage and peril for everyone. Besides the forced conclusion, which may not work optimally for anyone, and how can that not be stimulated? In working with communities trying to negotiate with those who hold power, there are a variety of methods and means by which attempt to promote change. The first requirement for change is that the identification of where benefits can be found for each group. We have identified some potential areas, but again, it will be critical for this process to occur within groups. Benefits also identify points of leverage. That is, if something is good, useful, desirable, what is the cost of its absence? This can then yield a range of potential pressure points to be used to promote change.
We know that the Ryukyu people have been very thoughtful in their approach to regaining access to remains. We may not have anything useful to add, but we would like to make suggestions around the engagement of allies to create leverage with biological anthropologists. The engagement of allies and influencers can be an important pathway for promoting change. Allies can be local, regional, national, or international, and they can represent a variety of perspectives on the issue. So, for example, having an ally who is a highly visible politician, a popular entertainer, or a respected organization can bring different kinds of support for a cause. Allies can also be found or developed in a variety of contexts and engaged to, for example, enhance the visibility of the issue and sympathy for the descendant situation, activate networks that increase the cost or lack of engagement, support and endorse activism specific to the issue, provide time and financial resources to support changes. There is a dimension where allies with specific potential leverage for academic researchers can be found or developed. That dimension is the professional academic world. Appealing to the many different potential sources of academic support and recognition could bring specific pressure to bear. Such could include professional societies, both national and international, research funders, national and international, accreditation organizations, publishers of international articles specific to the issue, groups of academics. There are many opportunities for engaging with allies and influencers where the support can help to overcome the agenda, past impasses, and reach to a new place in discussions. The purpose of engaging with allies and influencers is to raise broad support, increase the cost to the researchers for lack of engagement, and to create a greater degree of balance between the parties. This is a persuasive technique and does not have to be oppositional. This can then potentially lead to useful communication. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list, and we know that you have all been very thoughtful about developing allies. These may be a few additional thoughts.
Everyone defining priorities for process and outcomes clarifies both overlaps and divergences. Defining the belief and values that bridge communities and cultures and raising them up to reflect a shared vision can be a step to reduce the gap that currently leaves participants in this discussion without a common vocabulary, from which to communicate and build a bridge on which common humanity can be shared.
We began by asking about home. Home is a place of acceptance, care, and understanding. If those conditions do not exist for the Ryukyuan people, how can anyone truly be home? We explored dehumanizing effects of the lack of engagement and treatment of human remains. We explored harm and some potential benefits and opportunities for change. These are pathways to honoring our shared humanity. None will be simple, as you already so know. All will make us better. We thank you for your indulgence.
And we hope that in the near future, the Ryukyuans will be able to say "Okaeri" to your ancestors. Thank you.
どうもありがとうございました。では、次の、登壇者の方をお迎えしたいと思います。次の登壇者はエドワード・ハレアロハ・アヤウさんです。再埋葬と遺骨返還を通したハワイ先住民の人間性というタイトルでのお話です。よろしくお願いいたします。
Aloha kako, o au Edward Halealoha Ayau, he keiki a Reynolds Lealoha Ayau, ku makua kane, me kanoa hine o Muro Moaniki Alaka Eo, ku makua hine, he keiki a Harry Ahiona Ayau ne, ku ututu hine, lau o Paul Kamoholi Iha Pai, ku ututu kane, mai ho'ole hua molokai mai au, noho wau I Pauka'a Hilo Hawaii. I gotta fill in time while they find my PowerPoint. I wanted to focus my comments and my presentation on ways that would help inspire and uplift all those indigenous people, especially from here in Okinawa, who are struggling to get their ancestors home. A path that we have taken for the last 33 years and have achieved success. The title of my presentation is Hawaiian Humanity Through Repatriation and Reburial. The care of our ancestors has allowed us to share the most important value we have to offer to the world, and that is aloha. I am the executive director of Hui'iwi Kuamo'o. We are the successor organization to Hui Malama Ina Kupuna o Hawaiʻi. Pictured here are my kumu, Edward and Pualani Kanahele. This is part of our genealogy of knowledge. We were taught the ancestral landscape before we could become effective advocates and practitioners of repatriation. In 33 years, we have conducted 146 formal repatriation cases involving nearly 6,500 ancestral Hawaiian remains from institutions in the United States, Australia, Canada, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, and New Zealand. And in time, because we're working on those cases now, France, Russia, and Japan. Next slide, please. I want to start with lessons that we have learned over the past 33 years in the hopes that it helps bring clarity or helps support those struggling to get their ancestors home. So the first one, interdependent relationship. This says that the relationship between ancestral Hawaiians and living Hawaiians is one of interdependence, not independent. They're not over there, we're over here. Interdependent, each relying on the other, whereby each side relies on the other for their health and well-being. It is imperative that we reestablish a relationship with our ancestors to request their support in all aspects of our lives, including efforts to repatriate and rebury them, so that we can restore our ancestral foundation and return their mana, their spiritual essence, back to the homeland, to our Aina Kulaiwi. Duty of care. The care of Iwi Kupuna is a duty more than a right, because it is grounded in responsibility and not entitlement. This means we must actively take the initiative to search museums, agencies, private individuals all around the world to find the Iwi Kupuna and bring them home for reburial. Oh, I'm sorry, go back. Previous slide. No, that one. Iwi identity, the third one down. Maintaining the duty to care for Iwi Kupuna is a profound expression of who we are as Kanaka Oiwi. Literally, what our ancestors called themselves, Oiwi, means of the bone, which means they saw themselves in terms of their ancestors. So it's the care of Iwi Kupuna goes to our very identity. The importance of ceremonial protocol, prayers, chants, songs, are the effective forms of communication with the ancestors utilized to request that they provide us all the tools we need to behave responsibly, including knowledge, strength, intelligence, understanding, spiritual communication, and mana. It is required that we call upon them by name, hence the importance of mo'okuauhau, of genealogy. Death is not the end. It is a transition. Our ancestors yearn to be functional in the family again, to provide for their descendants, but you have to call them by name. Traditional proverbs that guide our behavior. I'm going to share two of them. First one, mai kaula ina iwi kala. It means do not expose the bones to the sun. Do not expose them to the light. Because the uhani, or the spirit, associated with the iwi, resides in po, in darkness. And the proper place for iwi is to be placed in the aina, in the land. So mana from the iwi can nourish the land physically and spiritually. Translated into modern terms, this also means no physical examination, no photography, no intrusive and non-intrusive studies, no x-rays, no gleaning of information without permission. The second traditional proverb, "Mai lave vale ina mea I ho'omoi puia," which means don't wantonly take things placed with the dead. This provides that the placement of items with the deceased establishes an inseparable bond, whereby the items are forever considered moipu, the possessions of the dead. So this makes clear that the prohibition against disturbing iwi extends to the moipu. This requires discipline, even from living Hawaiians. Okay, now next slide. Advocacy is critical. If a museum says no to repatriation, take it to mean not yet, and insist until no changes to yes. Because the question is not whether the ancestors come home. The only question is when. At times, repatriation advocacy amounts to hostage negotiations. So do not fail because you are their only hope to get home. Networking is the backbone of repatriation. Collaborative efforts with repatriation practitioners, archaeologists, anthropologists, researchers, lawyers, including the good folks at RRR, which stands for Return, Reconcile, and Renew, out of the Australian National University, was critical to our success through the sharing of experiences, strategies, provenance research information, identifying which museums have the ancestors, who the cooperative staff are, and who to stay away from. Start a repatriation by envisioning the result. This is a lesson that was taught to us by our kumu. If you start by envisioning the end, then you can work with the courage and confidence in knowing how things will turn out. It will take time. Our longest case lasted 27 years. Free, prior, and informed consent is required. If I could summarize repatriation work in one word, it would be consent. Absolutely and without exception, whereby the burden of proof is on the possessor of the iwi kupuna, moipu, or sacred object, and not on the claimant to prove a family member authorized the taking. Otherwise, it is theft. Because these are principally family matters. And then context of injustice. Context of injustice is a standard used in Europe. Context of injustice is best defined by the victims. The very fact that the museum, institution, or individual who is not family is in possession of iwi kupuna is proof positive of an injustice. Please, colonizers, spare us your lectures about scientific entitlement. Science does not have a seat at the family table unless invited. So we're not saying no to science, we're saying when we ask for it. Okay, next. Top picture was our first repatriation from the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. That's me in the light gray shirt. That was about 30 pounds ago. And the bottom is our it's a pahukoa that we built to repatriate the ancestors from the island I'm from Molokai. My grandmother told me if you're going to tell people to clean their house, you make sure you clean ours first. And so we brought our Molokai ancestors home first. Next. This is Po. This is the world where our ancestors reside in. In 1994, we went to Harvard and Yale Peabody museums. We did them on the same trip. We live very far away, so we can't afford to keep flying back and forth. And then they went back to Po. Okay, next. We also began repatriating sacred objects. So in the picture to the left, that is a ki'ila'au. It's a spear rest that was used by a warrior chief. Picture to the right, repatriation is just the front end of the work, which is hard, but the harder work is reburial. And in this case, we had to sail up the Northwest Hawaiian Island chains to the islands of Nihoa and Mokumanamana to rebury iwi kupuna, repatriated from the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. Next. This is still part of that trip in 1997. Next. Picture to the left is the public handover ceremony at Roger Williams Park Museum in Providence, Rhode Island of the Ki'ila'au. The picture to the right, the best advice I could give today is there's no more effective tool in repatriation advocacy than face-to-face negotiation. Face-to-face. Because one, it allows the claimant to express their grief, but it also makes clear the importance of the repatriation work. And it allows for shared humanity, which I hope is the overall lesson that we get from this. This is myself and Kunani Nihipali, former head of Hui Molama. This is one of the fastest repatriation cases we ever were involved in. It took less than a year. University of Edinburgh, the key is if you go to Scotland and you want to repatriate, tell them how much you dislike the British. All right, next. Repatriation of another sacred object, Kaina Valvai. This object is a sandstone, but carved into the sandstone are footprints and boot marks. And it is part of the prophecy of Ku'una, who was a kaula, a prophet. And she prophesied the coming of the white man, of foreigners, for which she was killed. And the item really wasn't stolen so much as it was carved out of the ground and sent away to protect it from cattle ranching. And so we were able to bring it home. This is where I grew up. This is our ice box of Molokai. This is where you learn to fish, dive, pick pihi. And we returned Kaina Valvai back home to our island. Next. This case took 23 years from when we first started asking the British. They refused to even share information. They chose even to lie at the beginning, just say that they didn't have them. But we were able to get an inventory, not through them voluntarily, but on our own. And it took us 23 years before the British finally agreed to repatriate. There was 153 of our ancestors. In the picture here, I don't know if they were trying to trick us, but there was one skull there that wasn't our kupuna. And so we made sure that it didn't go with us back home. Okay, next. Fast forward to more recent. This is the Übersee Museum in Bremen, Germany. It's in northern Germany. Who has a very progressive director and very progressive view. The Germans have been asking, as part of the repatriation process, to do public handover ceremonies. Public handover ceremonies involve them apologizing for the actions of their predecessors. Healing for us, healing for them. The acknowledgement, the atonement of this wrong. And remember now, they're not the ones who committed the wrong. They're the ones atoning for it. And you have to really recognize and applaud the courage it takes to do something like that. Next. These are my two main home mana and Kalihua, and they're doing what's called pikai. It's sprinkling of salt water for purposes of cleansing, because the kupuna are in the space that the living is in. So this is intended to cleanse everyone so that they can return to their families. Next. Then we went to the George August University in Göttingen. They have a very progressive repatriation program. We were one of the first indigenous groups notified. We immediately came to Germany to get them and take our ancestors home. Next. Then we went to the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena to conduct a similar repatriation. And for those who may be in the museum or community, they're getting nervous that the lines may be coming for the remains that you have. Let me say this. Repatriation is the beginning of the discourse. It really is. I just did a presentation for Jena a year and a half later to educate through a symposium there. I did it online on repatriation. So it's not the end of, the sky's not going to fall. It is actually the beginning of the discourse. Next. And then the Museum of Prehistory and Early History. This is actually the former Nazi museum in Berlin. that we were able to get our ancestors home. This case was especially contentious, as you might imagine, but we were able to get all 30 of the kupuna back. Next. And then we went to Vienna to do a repatriation ceremony from the Natural History Museum. Their national officers came to take part and to apologize to us and to the kupuna for the taking of the ancestors. Next. This is how we repatriate when the numbers are small. This is again the London Natural History Museum. When they initially repatriated, they withheld 8 of them, claiming that this scientific process had determined they were not Hawaiian, even though the historic record clearly indicated they were taken from Hawaiian burial sites. So we networked with a physical anthropologist in the US named Dr. Alan Goodman, who then proceeded to explain to the Natural History Museum that craniometrics is scientific voodoo. And the museum immediately returned, well, immediately in British terms means like 10 years, returned the 8 ancestors. And so this is us bringing them back. We recognize, I'm the last of the original students of Edward Halealoha Ayau. So as you can see, I'm not getting any younger. So we're training the next generation of practitioners, which I highly recommend. If you're an advocate, make sure you're training the next level. And these are Kamakana Ferreira, who's with Office of Foreign Affairs, a very effective advocate, and then the rest of my students. Next. And then I was closed with the thoughts of Lord Gladstone, who said, "Show me the manner in which a nation or community cares for its dead, and I will measure with mathematical exactness the tender sympathies of its people, the respect for the laws of the land, and their loyalty to high ideals." For Hawaiians, we have as much a humanitarian duty rather than a legal right to behave responsibly to our ancestors, to each other, and the future generations who will inherit the just immense responsibility of Kuleana known as Hawaii. Ola naivi, the bones live. Aloha.
ハレアロハさん、どうもありがとうございました。それでは次の発表者のご登壇をお願いします。次の発表者はサブリナ・アガワルさんです。反レイシスト的生物考古学の、実現をするための解体と脱構築作業、ちょっと口が回らなくなっちゃったです。よろしくお願いいたします。
Well, social movements related, actually, sorry, next slide. Sorry.
Next.
Just a warning, I do have some images of human remains. There are no images of Native American ancestors or indigenous ancestors. They are modern South Asian ancestors, but just a warning. Next slide, thank you. While social movements related to racial inequality and oppression dominate popular media, anthropology has begun to confront the ethics of how and why we obtain, analyze, and curate material remains. This is particularly acute in the case of human remains, with institutions globally holding skeletal remains of those taken without permission or consent. I am a bioarchaeologist. I study skeletal remains of the ancient and recent past, together with historical and archaeological context, in order to understand past lifeways. I'm specifically interested in how health and disease are shaped at the intersection of gender, racial, and class inequality. I only study remains with descendant community approval and collaboration. However, the field of biological anthropology and the study of biological variation of the past is founded on racist and eugenic science. Next slide. In recent years, bioarchaeologists have been keen to reimagine an anti-racist and decolonized practice. But how can we do that? I argue that to envision a just and relevant bioarchaeology, we need to first deconstruct and dismantle the practices that continue to maintain colonial violence. Using two examples in which I am professionally and personally situated, the holdings of Native Americans at the Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley, and the historical collection and use of teaching collections from South Asia or India, I deconstruct here the ways that bioarchaeology has been enmeshed in colonial biopower, necroviolence, and institutional racism. Next slide. The Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley is one of the oldest museums in the Western United States and the largest in California. What was called salvage ethnography and archaeology accumulated an array of films, recordings, photographs, baskets, sacred belongings, as well as human remains. While the museum holds Native American ancestors and belongings from around the United States, at its largest there were approximately 12,000 Native American ancestors. The largest percentage are from California tribes. Ancestors and cultural property were taken without consent across the U.S. for over a century in violation of Indigenous communities' spiritual and cultural beliefs. Native Americans were viewed by white scholars incorrectly as dying or a disappearing race that needed to be preserved in the context of violent settler colonialism that included forced removal, slave trafficking, and genocide. The collection of human remains in museums is particularly unique. The collection of human remains globally was primarily driven by craniometric or skeletal skull measurements that were used to reify racial differences. In the 19th century, the scientific study of human remains was intimately linked to the necropolitical projects entwined in land appropriation and erasure. In the case of California archaeology, to many of the early mid-20th century scientists, collection of human remains was simply regarded as an accepted scientific practice of the time. This is a very famous anthropologist historically in the 20th century named Alfred Kroeber, who was a cultural anthropologist, but he collected and supervised a collection of ancestors from across the U.S. and especially California. Next slide. What's salient or important to me is what happened after that time period, the ways that practices of 20th century anthropologists specifically upheld and normalized the necropolitical actions of our forefathers. At UC Berkeley, the 1950s brought the development of what was called the new physical anthropology and the growth of a prominent department in the U.S. In the late 70s, they hired renowned paleoanthropologist Tim White. During this time, the collection of human remains continued, not for craniometric studies of race, but the growing study of adaptation or evolution. The passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, called NAGPRA, in 1990, which was a human rights legislation intended as ethical redress, protection, and a mechanism for the return of Native American remains and sacred belongings or objects, gave the Hearst Museum millions of dollars for repatriation compliance of its collections. But rather than redress, I argue that the practices and policy of the museum and campus during this period actually served to normalize 19th century scientific racism and uphold necropolitical logics. In this case, specifically the idea that Native Californians had indeed become extinct. Next slide. There are two key practices that particularly illustrate this. The first was the categorization of the majority of the ancestral remains in the museum as culturally unidentifiable. Under NAGPRA law, tribes can only make a successful claim to their ancestors and belongings if cultural affiliation or relationship can be shown between the ancestors or belongings and present-day federally recognized groups. The majority of ancestors and belongings in the Hearst were able to be classified as culturally unidentifiable due to the fact that the majority were affiliated from federally unrecognized tribes. This CUI classification gave the campus a basis for denying repatriation of these human remains by specifically utilizing only scientific interpretation of shared group identity. Traditional tribal knowledge for affiliation was discounted or ignored. Instead, leadership of the museum used an interpretation that cultures that are transformed by biological or cultural hybridization are no longer the same or cease to exist. This argument sustains the erasure of Native American existence and essentially disregards the fact that necropolitical policies, namely genocide, enslavement, and forced displacement, is the reason for the complexities in Native American California history. The second practice used by the museum during this period that reinforced the erasure of Native Americans was the scientific categorization of human remains. Under the curatorship of Professor White, the Native American remains that were deemed unidentifiable were rigorously cataloged and prepared as a global resource for prehistoric skeletons for comparative anatomy. This entailed the separation of sacred belongings from ancestral remains, but also the disassembly of individual remains into assemblages or parts categorized by skeletal element, age, or appearance of disease. The violence of this treatment of ancestral remains cannot be understated, and it illustrates how Tim White, as a representative of the state of California, demonstrated the biopower of the state over Native California. For example, with federal funding, he created a teaching collection held in a locked state facility of approximately 800 specimens to illustrate pathological elements that were separated from the full individual, and another subset of infants and children that were separated for a growth and developmental series. Of all the practices by osteologists, this is one of the most disturbing for Native people. Separation and categorization create ease for scientific study, but transform humans into objects that naturalize past structural violent practices of fragmentation. For descendants, these practices dishonor ontological beliefs, but also dehumanize and racialize. As of 2019, there is a moratorium on all research and teaching involving Native American ancestors. This professor has retired, Tim White, and the campus's intention is to repatriate all Native American NAGPRA-eligible ancestors and belongings. But it is slow. There are still 9,000 ancestors and approximately 250,000 or more sacred belongings in the museum. Next slide. The continuing slow violence of colonial and imperial necropolitics is also illustrated in my second example of deconstruction related to legacy and anatomical teaching collections. Human remains from India were the primary global source of human bones for almost 180 years, with an estimated peak of 60,000 skeletons a year exported prior to the ban in 1985. Why India, and how the story of how India became to be the largest producer and exporter of prepared anatomical skeletons begins during British colonial rule and is set in the history of medicine and anatomy itself. Next slide. During the growth of medical education in the 18th and 19th century in both Europe and North America, there began the greater need for bodies to be used for medical training and dissection, and thus the widespread practice of grave robbing of the impoverished and racially disenfranchised. When the 1932 Anatomy Act was passed in Great Britain, it served to reduce grave robbing, but it led primarily to the increased use of unclaimed bodies. However, there continued to be a demand and a shortfall for cadavers in dissecting rooms, and as such, Britain looked to its colonies, particularly as it began medical education in India. India established the first medical college that you see here in this picture, and a hospital in Kolkata in West Bengal in 1833. In India, the British utilized and adapted the caste system for the procurement and preparation of bodies. Next slide. In the dissection rooms of hospitals and colleges, the British relied upon the community members called DOMs. DOMs were and are widespread in many areas of India, particularly in Bengal and Bihar, and represent one of the lowest of all castes in India. They are despised by even the untouchables. They fulfill tasks that are considered particularly polluting and defiling, like removing animal carcasses and tending to the human dead in burning cremation grounds. It is perhaps tempting to consider the elaborate Hindu rituals of death and everyday handling of the dead by these castes as a natural extension to the business of preparation of anatomical human remains. However, DOMs were actually forced and pressed into the service of human dissections, and a deep loathing and suspicion of cutting up bodies in India persisted during the 19th century, even amongst the DOMs themselves. What is key here to emphasize is that the establishment of Western medicine in India, and with the practice of dissection and the collection of human remains, was actually integral to the colonizing process itself. The use of Indian bodies, both the dead and the doms, served as a site of colonizing biopower. The corporality of colonialism in India stood in the space of medicine as a place to use the body for discipline, control, authority, and legitimacy. We see here the obvious parallel to the colonial violence just discussed at the same time happening in the settler states of the US. Next slide. But in the colony of India, there was an unparalleled opportunity. By the 1850s, the Calcutta Medical College alone was processing 900 skeletons a year for shipment abroad. This number would multiply in the following decades, fueled during the various periods of pandemic and famine. The export of anatomical specimens from Calcutta particularly expanded during World War II and following the famines. The Bengal famine of 1943 in the Bengal province of British India claimed the lives of up to 3 million people to starvation and disease, with a disruption in local economy and destruction of agrarian communities and families. It is well known that bone traders from Calcutta exported skeletons specifically from famine victims starting in the 1930s and the decades following the famines. Next slide. The export of Indian bodies continued after the end of the colonial era in complex ways that related not only to colonizing power, but also the Indian response that included accommodation, participation, and appropriation. Following the independence of India, the export of human skeletons continued to grow exponentially with the demands from medical schools and students abroad. It is estimated that Calcutta exporters traded almost $1.5 million worth of skeletons just prior to the ban in 1985, with other estimates as high as 5 or 6 million. The Chicago Tribune estimated that 60,000 skulls alone were shipped from Calcutta. If we use a conservative estimate of 40 years of exports of similar size in the years prior to 1985, that would be approximately 2.4 million skeletons or skulls exported outside of the US, outside of India, sorry. This does not even account for the skeletons or skulls collected for pathological or cranial studies in the 100 years prior to independence. And we know those were well documented in museums globally. Next slide. Excuse me. The ethical use and curation of Indian anatomical remains is difficult to envision through the lens of 2 centuries of fluid power dynamics that began from colonial practices and continued with the production of anatomical skeletons domestically. I argue that part of our difficulty also lies in the materiality of the craft skeletal bodies themselves. While individuals that were taken and skeletonized over the course of the 200 years came from varying villages, religions, ghats, and cemeteries, they were transformed into uniform anatomical objects. The success of the bone trade in India was built on its renowned ability to produce standardized specimens. Bodies were processed meticulously. Corpses were often wrapped and anchored in rivers to be dismembered naturally by bacteria and fish. Crews of hands would scrub and boil the bones in water and caustic soda to dissolve the flesh, and sun and hydrochloric acids would be used to produce medical-grade, gleaming white skeletons with high-quality, distinguishable landmarks. Exports to North America were strikingly similar and unmatched by the exporters from China or Eastern Europe. Both males and females were usually represented. Most are similar, young-aged, intact teeth, little or no pathology or trauma. The selective and transformative process was explicitly crafted to rid the signs of the individual, and specifically the brown individual. Unlike other skeletal specimens like those that were held at the Hearst Museum in Berkeley, these skeletons were assigned or retained partial histories because they were valuable for comparative studies of human variation. The value of these Indian bodies came from erasing any history, in making them geographically displaced. What is clear is that the Indian skeletons that make up our global collections were never willed or donated, their bodies subject to structures of biopower and violence that are similar to the archaeological skeletons housed in museums. Their continued use is a result of our historic complicity and scientific opportunism. Next slide. Why is it important to deconstruct not just the colonial history of skeletal collections, but also the practices of contemporary anthropologists. I argue that contemporary anthropologists' actions, inactions, and conditioning serve to breed and naturalize scientific racism and necropolitical logics. For example, at the School of Biomedical Studies at the University of Queensland in Australia, scientists have reportedly taken steps to decommission their historic osteological collection from India. However, the scholars have framed the replacement of their teaching collections as a remedy to offer improved and representative collections and to replace them with authentic skeletons, language that is harmful with racist undertones. Further, while the dedication to replace the teaching skeletal collections with remains from will donors is admirable, attention is also required for the ethical and equitable disposition of Indian skeletal remains, which currently do not match protocols of commemoration and cremation for their contemporary white donor bodies. Other institutions have attempted to extend the ethical mandates of NAGPRA law to the disposition of non-Native American human remains with limited provenance information, with recommendations such as communal reburial for teaching collection remains. However, remains from South Asia likely include individuals of both Hindu and Muslim faith, and the former faith quite strongly favors cremation of the dead. It should not be considered ethical to repatriate South Asian remains to other descendant groups, for example, under other indigenous protection laws. Further, it is not feasible or appropriate to repatriate these ancestors to a country, India, that as of 2021 has a population of 1.4 billion and face the disposal themselves of 10.2 million dead in 2021. But also a country that does not implement a Uniform Anatomy Act across its states, and it continues to allow the acquisition of anatomical cadavers from unclaimed bodies. What is key is that who should decide what happens to these skeletal remains needs to be South Asian descendants both abroad and in India, but with the expectation that we simply cannot expect compliance with the ethics of the global north. While the practice and policies of collection and repatriation of human remains at UC Berkeley reflect both institutional racism and white patriarchy, the influence of contemporary actors on the program of repatriation of the hearse cannot be denied. For over 3 decades, Tim White determined how one of the largest collections of Native American ancestors would be curated, studied, withheld, and how the very fields of osteology and bioarchaeology would be practiced in the past 3 decades. Tim White's influence persisted not only in Berkeley, one of the leading programs in archaeology and biological anthropology, but also globally. Why were Tim White's actions sustained and influential and continue to be? Part of the answer is that he is not alone. Scattered across California, the United States, and globally, there are biological anthropologists and archaeologists that share his assertions and stance to maintain the scientific culture in anthropology. These legacies of scientific racism are global and can be traced as intellectual genealogy. For example, students of Tim White are found globally and have established these modes of thought and practice, most especially here in Japan. And I'm out of time, so I'm just going to show you my last slide. Trying to reconcile the different epistemologies or approaches regarding human remains need to be dependent on the movement towards an ontological frame rather than an epistemological frame, asking us to appreciate the different subjectivities of skeletal remains, the different beliefs that different communities have developed in their own minds towards their own ancestral remains. We do not need to say that the scientific study of human remains is universally unethical, but we need to find the spaces where the ontological beliefs of descendants and researchers have better resonance. And in some cases, there will be many spaces, and in other cases, there will be none. And scientists need to appreciate and understand that. The next speaker, Professor Blakey, will talk about collaborative research is possible, and we see this in his groundbreaking work in the New York African Burial Ground Project, and even in contemporary bioarchaeologists like myself. These are photos from a project a few weeks ago in the territory of Puerto Rico in the US, where we are working with descendant communities to rescue human remains that are coming up and are found on the National Park World UNESCO Heritage Site Trail. You can see the human remains, thousands coming up on the trail. We're working with the community to rescue them. The comparison of Native American and Indian ancestors is not symmetrical. but both underscore the landscape of colonial violence that multiple skeletal collections have been forged in globally around the world. We must hone our curiosity and inquiry towards different ontological beliefs with the expectations that these will vary in descendant communities globally in ways that we might not know yet. Our job in reimagining the future is to unite our practice, to craft a bioethos of everyday practice that will be able to rehabituate us towards a compassionate and meaningful bioarchaeology. Arigato.
ガウルさんありがとうございました。それでは次のスピーカーのご登壇をお願いいたします。マイケル・ブレイキーさんです。ご発表はニューヨーク市アフリカ埋葬地プロジェクトです。
こんにちは、ございます。You have the first slide? This is it? Okay. Let me begin by contrasting with the contrasting story of an unethical and misleading science of race. One's point of view is defined as well by its opponents as by its friends. Second slide. Well, I think this one. During the 1990s, when the African burial ground was revealed, forensic anthropologists at the Smithsonian Institution's Natural History Museum, defeated then by Native people's successful NAGPRA law, which were required to repatriate the tens of thousands of Indian skeletal remains to their culturally affiliated tribes. But the very oldest of these remains, from Kennewick, Washington, were prized by my colleagues for the stories they might tell. Those who had all along the 1980s opposed Native rights to their ancestral remains racialized the 9,500-year-old Kennewick remains that the Umatala of the indigenous people called the Ancient One, to say his head was shaped more like a Eurasian than current Indians. Therefore, they argued in court, he was not culturally related to Native Americans. They sought to classify these first Native Americans as white people, Caucasoid, as they had classified the Ainu, not only creating an interesting story of European entitlement to the land, but allowing them to circumvent legal claims of Indians and take samples from Kennewick for nearly 30 years. Of course, his head shape was different from that of American Indians today. As any evolutionist would easily predict, all humans change and diversify as local populations over long stretches of time. And Indian origins were in Northeast Asia. The Ancient One is exactly who an archaic Indian should look like. But the idea of race, to call this skeleton Caucasoid, removes him from time and space to falsely construct his affinity to the British. Danish geneticists, however, proved that the Ancient One was genetically more like Native Americans than any other human group, after 25 years in the hands of my colleagues and not in the hands of his descendants. These white colleagues thought race to be an objective method. Certainly, they had objectified Kennewick as a thing belonging to them. The training of these colleagues, Doug Owsley and Richard Jantz among them, was at the University of Tennessee under William Bass, a forensic anthropologist who believed in race, reporting race, sex, age, and stature of the occasionally missing person to the police and courts. Objectified race as though an essential naturalized thing, rather than as groups defined by their cultural histories, represents a brand of dehumanization. That long-standing approach participates in the idea that scientific interpretations are somehow neutral, for which no evidence actually exists. Instead, we see evidence of the intuitive perspectives of the scientist observers, in this case, the historic subjectivity of white Americans looking for the answers convenient to them. Next slide. 30 years ago, these were the kinds of racializing forensic anthropologists who were on site claiming the right to analyze New York City's 300-year-old African burial ground. Not only did our Howard University, the leading African-American research university, our Howard University research team take over the site's archaeology with community activist support, we transformed it to a humane self-discovery of history for and by the African-American people. We also extended descendant community control of skeletal remains from archaeological sites to everyone, not only Native Americans under NAGPRA. In fact, we coined the term descendant community with our project. Thus, through a clientage model of public engagement, we operated on the basic ethical principle of informed consent, choosing to do research only with descendants' permission. The African burial ground is the cemetery enslaved Africans used in 18th century New York to bury 15,000 people who built the city, and whose people, today owed $42 trillion, we are told, created the original wealth of the Western world. Next slide. This map shows the 419 people excavated during the U.S. General Services Administration's construction of an office tower in Manhattan. Next slide. In the 1990s, African Americans led protests against the desecration of their cemetery by archaeologists and federal developers. Next slide. The legislative and scholarly power the descendant community brought, and here you see in the center Mayor David Dinkins, would stop construction and archaeological excavation. Next slide. I entered with a multiracial research team of 30 PhDs and 200 researchers at 9 labs and universities, led by Black archaeologists, historians, and biological anthropologists. We introduced a completely new project. This slide is my first meeting with the original archaeological crew we would replace. Next slide. We instituted a clientage model of public engagement that you see here, assigning to the descendant community, the ethical client, the African American community, the right to determine whether research would be done or not, and the right to determine the questions about their past we would undertake, if allowed to perform as scholars. I refer to this as the democratization of knowledge. We established 4 questions: African American origins and transformations, the physical circumstances of their enslavement, and their modes of resistance. These were their questions. Together with the community, we introduced into broad public use their terms, including enslaved Africans, rather than the objectifying term slaves, and were allowed to begin the most comprehensive bioarchaeological project yet conducted, and on behalf of the Black community. Next slide. The remains were brought to Howard University in a massive Ties That Bind ceremony, organized by dramaturgist Eleanor Traylor and others in 1994. Next slide. Here is Joseph Jones, one of 25 students who cleaned, inventoried, and analyzed every bone. An Ifa shrine was kept in the Cobb Laboratory, all of which saw regular tours and visitors from around the world for the 10 years of research. We knew these bones as our ancestors, whose human social history, whose lives in Africa, the Caribbean, and New York, we restored to memory, rather than to objectify them as negroids, which our forensic colleagues were inclined to do. We asserted that, with informed consent, better science could be conducted while adhering to humane and ethical principles. I will add that at all times, the descendant community had the right to choose not to have research done at all and proceed directly to memorialization. Next slide, please. Part of our process with the community involved their reburial in sacred space in 2003 with the Schaumburg organized rites of ancestral return. Next slide. By 2007, next slide please, the memorialization of the site which the GSA had sought to limit to a plaque on the wall of their building became a U.S. national monument under the Park Service. Next slide. A visitor center, many times larger than the one upon which the federal government had first insisted, opened in 2009 after protracted activist struggle. A struggle once interrupted by the destruction of our archaeology laboratory at 6 World Trade Center in 9/11. Time after time, the GSA tried to end the extensive research they had initially agreed to when the lights of activism were bright during the 1990s. They would, with few exceptions, fail. Next slide. Our research team, the most multi-ethnic team of anthropological researchers ever assembled in the U.S., joined in the reburial and dedication ceremonies at 290 Broadway. I would continue to lead the Howard Project to its completion by founding the Institute for Historical Biology at William & Mary. There we continue work towards its greater effects with other descendant communities. Next slide. Our 2,500-page volumes were published by Howard Press and can be accessed online at the National Monument website. Please do. Here are the contents of these unparalleled products of the long and careful project. Next slide. Yeah. And here are some of our results. Next slide. Next. Enslaved children, not seen here, were 40% of the dead and showed at least twice the infant mortality as among the English in the 18th century. That distinction continues today. For those who lived to adulthood, shown here, there was higher early mortality among Africans than the English for every age, with the exception of 25-year-olds. Only 2 to 3% of Africans lived that long. 7 to 9 times as many English men and women lived to old age as Africans, who had been forced to labor for their comfort. Next slide. Our search for origins inspired new methods. We were the first to examine the chemistry of the teeth. Among those with filed teeth who were born in Africa, we've identified places of birth by assessing the chemistry of the African ecologies of their childhoods. Next slide. Here is a section of an adult's dental enamel, next slide please, that had developed in childhood, sampled for elements like strontium and lead, which provide signatures of different regions of the world where they had lived. Next slide. Here, the first results of Joseph Jones and Alan Goodman, glad to hear about him earlier from Mr. Leah, shows that those with filed teeth had very low levels of lead compared to those who died as children, and whose chemical signatures showed exposure to lead as a marker of Western technologies. Our innovation of chemical sourcing has become an important new method for tracking the movement of people on the basis of the circumstances of their nurture, their conditions. Next slide. Everyone was excited about our use of DNA, among the first to use ancient DNA, as one of many lines of evidence used to roughly estimate the cultural origins of Africans in New York. No geneticist had ever asked about those origins until the Black community, through our engagement process, first posed the question. Next slide. Throughout the 1700s, the percentage of men in the enslaved African community of New York declined. The decline in men was associated with the African American rebellions of 1712 and 1741. And the turn to greater importation of women, then, may also have been an English attempt at greater social control. Here you see those changes in sex ratio using census data. Some argued that the urbanizing city's labor became more domestic, and slavery became more benign during the 18th century when women provided more of the labor. Perhaps the former is partly true. But what we found in muscular changes showed that more and more work was being loaded on the shoulders, backs, and thighs of all enslaved workers, especially African women, over the course of that century. We looked at the muscle attachments, next slide, in the back of the thigh, the linea aspera on the femur. You see a line where muscles were attached, which is enlarged by the work of its attached muscles. It leaves its evidence as arduous labor frozen among the dead. The relative number of Africans with enlarged linea increases over the course of the 18th century. Next slide. Women's hypertrophic or enlarged muscle attachments increase in frequency such that their record of arduous work comes to match that of men by the time of the American Revolutionary War at the end of the 18th century. The green line represents women, and the blue line is the trend in men. Back one, please. Forward one. That's it. Right. Enthesopathy, which is beyond the usual hypertrophy, which you see, the frequency of which you see here, is evidence of excessive strain, including the tearing of muscles at their attachments. The increasing frequency of enthesopathies over the course of the 18th century is graphically demonstrated here. The muscle strain on women's work comes gradually to exceed that of men. There's no other way to know these facts than through skeletal biology. Next slide. A final example of our research entails culture. The heart-shaped symbol on the coffin lid of burial number 101, a man in his 30s with filed teeth, may have represented the Akan or Ghanaian Adinkra symbol Sankofa, although we have looked at various possibilities. Archaeology is largely a matter of plausibility rather than absolute facts. Next slide. Sankofa became a symbol of the African burial ground as it came into broad public knowledge through our research. African Americans chose its meaning. Return to fetch the past as a guide to the present and future. To represent the sites significance to them. Next. Human beings know ourselves in the language of memorial. I call us Homo reminiscens, marked from our species' beginning as the one memorializer among all the species of the world. Next slide. Oh, this is good. Here you see those enslaved in the Caribbean in the 18th century marching in a funerary procession. Next slide. And here is the procession of the remains we had studied in our laboratory being walked home down Broadway to their new monument in 2007. Communities have followed our approach to public engagement of descendant communities to restore community rights, to determine the disposition of their dead in many parts of the world. Next slide. This is the Cemitario dos Pretos Novos in Rio de Janeiro, where the African Burial Ground Project has been referenced for 20 years. Next. The Institute for Historical Biology at William & Mary is advising or facilitating this list and many others, including Virginia Indians seeking to restore control over the sanctity of their dead and the telling of their story. Public engagement has been expanded by its use in many places, sometimes in the form of civic engagement that more talks the talk, performs the appearance of descendant empowerment, than it actually walks the walk of making it real. Fortunately, in 2018, the National Trust for Historic Preservation established a rubric for engagement far beyond the protection of cemeteries. 50 scholars and descendants met at James Madison's Montpelier, a presidential site, to set as a standard of historic preservation that descendant communities should be truly empowered by structural parity, equal control, to tell the story of their enslaved ancestors and place slavery at the center of the telling of American history at museums and historic sites. We acknowledge that the African Burial Ground led the way. Next and last slide. This one. As co-chair of the American Anthropological Association's new Commission for the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains, my colleagues, like Professor Agarwal and I, are going around the world with Wintergren Foundation funding for listening sessions. We want to know the concerns of our colleagues and of descendant communities in Japan, Australia, Africa, Europe, and the United States regarding the treatment of human remains by bioarchaeologists and museums, to begin to recommend change. We take with us a very limited number of examples of past ethical work, prominently including the African Burial Ground Project. Once your thoughts are added to the conversation, I believe new best practices and ethical standards for archaeology and biological anthropology will be right around the bend. I want to thank Professor Yoshinobu Ota and his distinguished team and the Ryukyuan representatives who we met with yesterday for allowing our commission to talk with you here in Okinawa. Thank you very much.
ブレイキーさん、どうもありがとうございました。それでは、次のご発表に移りたいと思います。次のご発表は、チップ・コルウェルさんの発表で、亡霊に疲れた私たちというタイトルです。
こんにちは。Thank you very much for having me here in the United States. I often begin a talk by doing what's called a land acknowledgement, which is an opportunity to acknowledge the indigenous peoples on whose land I am on. And so I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am a guest on the Ruyukan people's land, and I honor and recognize your ancestors, you today, and your future generations. So please allow me to begin with a story, a ghost story of sorts. In 1921, Dr. Alfred M. Bailey went on an expedition to collect animal skins for a museum diorama in Denver, Colorado. He traveled to Alaska into the Arctic Circle, to one of the northernmost settlements in the world. The village of Kivalina, as you see here, sits on a thin slice of land just 4 meters above sea level. Kivalina is a traditional Inupiat Eskimo village of several hundred people. Dr. Bailey perhaps felt that he was at the very edge of the world, perhaps a place beyond the dictates of human decency. In 1921, Dr. Bailey was a new curator whose job it was to collect animals to add to the museum's collections. And so, when he was out one day strolling the edge of Kivalina and saw a human skull eroding from a cemetery, his instinct was to take it. The skull Dr. Bailey took in Kivalina has haunted us ever since. It has haunted the descendant community, the Denver Museum, and perhaps all of us, not in that, like some horror movie, the skull itself is possessed or ghoulish. Rather, it is haunting because its removal embodies the casual violence that museum men like Dr. Bailey could visit upon a native community, like Kivalina, a symbol of how all indigenous peoples could be objectified as scientific specimens rather than treated as human beings. It is haunting, perhaps because even today that skull sits on a museum shelf in Denver, left in a legal and spiritual purgatory. The skull is not haunted, we are the haunted. I open with this story to make the point that repatriation is not a moment. Some might wish that repatriation, the demands of return of ancestral remains and belongings from museums to source communities or nations, is merely a late 20th century invention. Some in museums and political positions may hope that repatriation is just a passing political fad, that if they hunker down, it will pass soon enough. Equally, some indigenous leaders may wish that if they just work hard enough right now, that soon all their ancestors will be back safely under their care. I regret to inform both retentionist museum people and indigenous leaders that they are equally wrong. Repatriation is a movement. I mean to say that the wrongs that led to the need for repatriation have been laid down for centuries, literally. Since the 1400s, colonial powers from Europe have undertaken colonial expeditions to rob indigenous peoples of their resources, their lands, and way of life. This has included the theft of their ancestors' bodies and their most cherished religious objects. Equally, resistance to these cultural bandits is not a new development. For generations, indigenous peoples have survived in the face of their oppression. Indigenous peoples have protected their ancestral lands. They have long demanded that their ancestors' graves be left alone. Repatriation is a centuries-long struggle, a movement with a profoundly deep history, and, as a stolen head from Kivalina attests, a very long future ahead. This is what the anthropology of phantom reveals. Ghosts appear to us when there is a crime that was never prosecuted, an injustice that was never settled. In this presentation, I would like to give shape to this haunting history and to our waiting future. I would like to focus on how ethical demands led to legal frameworks for indigenous peoples in the United States. Then I will turn to how these ethical and legal claims have expanded beyond indigenous peoples in the United States to include other disenfranchised communities and have become a global and generational movement for justice. Before the demands for repatriation came, Native Americans first tried to stop the theft of their ancestors' graves by archaeologists. We only know of a handful of examples because most archaeologists could simply take note of their objections and then proceed with their excavations of cemeteries. Next slide, please. For example, in 1902, archaeologists began digging graves on Long Island in New York. a brief newspaper reports the Shinnecock Indians have entered protests against the excavating going on at Shinnerbone. The bones of some small Papoose Indian child were recently unearthed, and word was sent to M.R. Harrington in charge that he would lose the friendship of the tribe if he dug up any more bodies. But of course, Harrington just simply continued with the excavations. Many examples can be found that show how many Native Americans long objected to the excavation of their ancestral cemeteries and the theft of their ancestors' remains. However, starting in the late 1800s, U.S. law dictated that Native American historic sites on public lands were the heritage of the nation, and thus could be studied by credentialed scholars. All this began to change in the late 1960s, on the heels of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. After years of political disempowerment, Native Americans began to argue that they had legal and moral standing in relation to their own heritage. For example, in 1968, members of a pan-Indian rights organization, the American Indian Movement, invaded an archaeological excavation in Minnesota. The activists filled trenches, took shovels, and burned field notes. The activists offered to compensate the students for the stolen equipment, but insisted that the excavations end. Next slide, please. The arguments against archaeologists and the demands that their ancestors be left alone were based on numerous arguments, including colonialism, racism, violations of religious freedom, and violations of human rights. As a result of these protests, panicked museum officials around the United States began to remove human remains from display. Some even began to quietly return them. But most clung on, hoping that the demands would soon pass. Many offered a fiery defense. Many museum administrators offered a fiery defense in language and arguments that are still being made 50 years later, some that we are still hearing today in Japan, including around universal heritage, being the true keepers of history, and the freedom of speech and the sanctity of knowledge. The stalemate can be encapsulated in two very different worldviews. One in which the excavation, study, and storage of indigenous ancestral remains constituted a fundamental violation of human dignity, and another in which the research on human skeletal remains was a necessary practice of science. For many years, these two viewpoints were very far apart. While these two moral debates of right and wrong played out, U.S. law gradually began to shift to protect Native American graves and cemeteries. In 1976, the state of Iowa was the first to change its laws that gave Native American cemeteries the same protections as those of non-Native cemeteries. And when new graves were discovered, for example, during road construction, archaeologists and Native Americans would be called out together. And then they would excavate the graves, conduct limited non-destructive analyses, and then rebury the remains out of harm's way. Soon, other states followed. In 1990, the U.S. federal government, joined this movement. The U.S. Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. NAGPRA, as it's called, is a complex law, but most basically it allows Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, and tribes to claim human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony, meaning communally owned items, from museums and federal agencies. The law also established the custody of human remains and other cultural items discovered on federal lands after 1990. Penalty for noncompliance and illegal trafficking were enacted, and the law authorized a review committee and also a grants program to fund the efforts of museums and tribes. NAGPRA's passage was a political compromise between many tribal advocates that wanted everything returned from museums as soon as possible, and many in the scientific community who wanted nothing returned at all. But despite NAGPRA's flaws and limitations, most scholars and tribal leaders work within the law today. NAGPRA has resulted in the return of 15,000 sacred and communally owned items, 77,000 sets of human remains, and 2 million funerary items. Still, there are more than 100,000 unreturned ancestral remains and millions of belongings from graves that are sitting on museum shelves. But NAGPRA is strictly limited to Native Americans. In the last few years, scholars and communities have become acutely aware that other cemeteries are being destroyed and that museums hold the remains of other disenfranchised groups as well, most notably African Americans. Across the United States, African American cemeteries have undergone demolition and lay in relative obscurity under university parking lots, metro train stations, and parks. Next slide. Despite calls for preservation from high-profile archaeological projects, especially in the early 1990s, as we just heard from Professor Blakey, such as the New York African Burial Ground Project, and more recently, little has been done to create federal protections for historic Black cemeteries. African American cemeteries require additional protections because they were often unofficially situated at the edges of settlements and cities without formal fences or headstones because of the economic and political violences perpetrated against Black Americans. Additionally, there are the remains of Black Americans in museums. Harvard University's collection, it has been acknowledged, contains 15 African Americans who were enslaved. In 2020, the University of Pennsylvania announced that its anthropology museum would address the legacy of Samuel Morton's collection of 1,300 human skulls, which was deployed to denigrate the intelligence and character of African Americans and Native Americans. And other institutions have far more African American skeletons in their closets. Like Native Americans, African Americans have been turned into objects that deny their humanity. This objectification denies humanity because every known human culture has rituals and beliefs surrounding their dead. Next slide. To rob a people of those beliefs is to rob them of their humanity. To say somehow people who are seen as indigenous or African or any other minoritized people are somehow outside the scope of how the dead should be treated, as if they do not deserve our respect, but only our morbid or scientific curiosity. And just as these human rights are extending beyond Native Americans, they're extending beyond the United States. Yet there are currently no legally binding international laws that require repatriation. The closest is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, adopted by the United Nations in 2007. This international treaty's Article 12 includes descriptions around the rights to heritage and the right to return of ancestors and ceremonial objects. Slide. However, UNDRIP, while a profoundly important moral statement, has not translated to much legal action in the arena of repatriation. For instance, although France has ratified the treaty, in a lawsuit brought by the Hopi tribe to prevent the sale of sacred items, the French judge hearing the case found that the pieces were works of art and not living spirits, and thus nothing in the law prevented the auction from proceeding. In this story, 65 sacred objects were sold for US $1.2 million. Despite the lack of international law to require repatriations, many museums within countries and national museums are beginning to voluntarily return human remains, as again we've heard today. And what these powerful examples show is the further expansion of repatriation from a narrow question of Native American or Native Hawaiian indigenous peoples' rights in the United States to a movement of advocating for human rights across the globe. It is perhaps worth noting that Japan already has an expansive national repatriation program. Starting in the 1950s, the Japanese government sent its first missions to locate and bring home the remains of its soldiers, fallen in World War II. After decades of work, some 340,000 soldiers have been recovered, with most of them residing at Tokyo's Chidori-Gafuchi National Cemetery of Unknown Soldiers. Of course, there is not an exact moral equivalence between World War II soldiers lost overseas and the remains of indigenous peoples taken to museums. But I believe this could show that there is a national concern for human remains in Japan, and that the nation sees its ancestors as sacred even in death, that the remains are to be reclaimed so that they can be fully honored. Many indigenous peoples are simply asking that these same principles be applied to their own ancestors. In conclusion, I hope I have shown how repatriation is not new. Rather, the crisis has been brewing for centuries as colonizers extracted indigenous bodies and belongings for their own ends, a part of the long resistance against colonialism, an expression of emerging political power among indigenous peoples, and a growing articulation of human rights. Repatriation is not a moment, it is a movement. And this movement has long played out on two axes: ethical demands and legal entitlements. They will continue along these two fronts, first because the law must still be interpreted and acted upon, that is, ethical judgments are always at play, and second, because in many areas, for example, private collections and internationally, there are few legal guidelines and only the gray zone of morality. This movement started in part in the United States with Native Americans and Native Hawaiians, but is now extending broadly, seen as a choice about our commitments to human rights and extending dignity to all human beings. This will be a choice we make whether we see all humans as fully human, or whether some humans can be reduced to objects of science, heritage, and history. This movement began generations ago, and it will continue for generations to come. Consider that at the current pace of return, it will likely be a century before all Native American and Native Hawaiian remains in public U.S. museums have been consulted upon. And those 100 years of work do not even include remains held in private U.S. collections or internationally. The skull from Kivalina is the perfect, if tragic, example of why this work will last beyond our own time on Earth. In 2007, I was hired at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science as a curator and the official in charge of NAGPRA. One of the incomplete tasks I had charged to me was returning the skull from Kivalina. Within days of starting, I tried to contact those whose information I had in Kivalina. There was no answer. I called again, still no answer. I called again and again and again, and still no answer. I sent emails, I sent letters. I never received a reply. After a number of years, I decided that I would accomplish nothing else that year if not speak to someone in Kivalina. So I spent weeks tracking down possible leads, and I received a new phone number for a community leader. I called, the phone rang, and then finally, someone picked up. It was among the most difficult conversations I've ever had. I had to tell a stranger that a curator from my museum some 80 years earlier decided to steal a skull, their ancestor. The person on the other line asked a few questions, and I did my best to answer. What did I want to do, they finally asked. Return the remains home, I said. After a pause, the voice on the other end of the phone said that wouldn't be possible. Kivalina is one of the first places in the United States to be impacted so directly by climate change. Just a few inches above sea level at certain parts of the community, and all of it just several meters above sea level, the rising Arctic will soon wipe out the entire community. And so the people of Kivalina are moving inland, a slow and painful process. In other words, Kivalina is in crisis. The community had pressing issues to face and would not be able to find the time or resources to rebury a stolen ancestor. Until they could figure out their own future, the skull would have to sit in Denver, waiting. We will be the haunted for generations to come. Domo arigatou gozaimasu.
コルウェルさんありがとうございました。2時間余り経過しました。ここで休憩を10分間挟みたいと思います。この段階でご退出をということであればですね、同時通訳の機会をですね、必ず出口の方で返却するようにお願いいたします。それでは、15時50分から再開したいと思います。10分間の休憩を挟みます。
それは松島さんだったっけ？ だから僕は下の方からオペレーションしてるから。
なかなか大変ですね、これ対応15分遅れ。
松野さんもよろしくお願いします。はい。
これあげるは言えますかね。
松野さん、これ3列並べて、それであれをつける。
先ほど生のが入ってくるときと、皆さんと話し合うべきで。
ここにいらっしゃって。
というか、
それはそのままにしてる。
いや、もう一つある。
例だけど、50年ぐらいしてる。
それで、ちょっと真ん中眩しいから、この辺り、そう、ここはちょっと離して。そうなんだよ。それで、お三方が終わったら、ちょっとマスクさんがください。それは聞いて、お三方が
よろしくお願いします。
亀谷さんと。
はい、マンゴーありがとうございます。
辻さん、これはシャットっていうやつです。
これでも
そう、だからこれなんかシャッターみたいなやつ。
それは映写を消せばス
タンバイ。そういうのスタンバイ。
電源を落とさない。
今だからスタンバイボタンで電源は入ってる。あ、なるほど。これで照明ね、お二人あれなんですよ。スライドなしで口頭で喋られて、その後スライド上映でスピーチがある。だからもう一回マイクはあれですね。一人ずつ3人お三方発表するので、はい。でその後発表者の方が登壇をして、それでだからあれを貼ってもらおうかな。これを貼ってもらおうかな。で、順番で
お疲れ様です。お客さん多いからなかなかね、時間通りになるのが大変ですね。
ハレアロさんは
みんな喋りたいこといっぱいありますからね。
ちょっとね、人数を減らして、たくさん聞きたいところですけどね、
松島さん、やっぱりこう人が多い方がね、盛り上がるって言っていっぱい読まない。
今までもずっとしっかりして苦労してる。
マイクを持って喋ったら大丈夫ですか。ということは、こちらの方に来ていただいて、
私は辻と申します。
フラ
前
マイクを
回も
そこに置いて、
札幌からリモートで話させていただいたんですけど、1年前は、はい。
できればフラマイク、お仕事をし方は、
そうなんですよ。
フラマイク。
アイヌ先住民研究センターっていうところでもアイヌの遺骨問題とかもやっぱりなんとか解決したいと思って、
加藤さんにお願い
い
します。
ろいろ沖縄と同じようなことをやってるんですけど、
私たちもアイヌに学ばないといけません。
いえいえ、もうね、向こうも向こうで大変ですのでね、そんな簡単じゃないです。
そうですね。
はい、もうどっちも大変ですよ。
そう、同時に。
そっちも全く同じですよね。でもみんなで協力するとやっぱ盛り上がりますからね。やっぱり。
北原さんとしてこれ
準備はしてないんです。はい。佐藤さんとか北原さん。
準備これだけしかない。
ちた。
浜口さんいないよ。
お手洗いといいんじゃないかな。
そう。浜口さんに聞いてみないと。多分もっと。お手洗いじゃん。テープあるはずです。これを。
皆さんはここでいいんですね。
松島、太田、それで全部で9人なんですよ。
次のスタートは50分ですか
？50分ですね。はい。
だから
遅れで
9人分しか準備できない。そう。
松島さん、パソコンの
椅子はここの後ろに
映像ケーブル
でもう一台
つないだ方がいいですね。
ここもう一つですね。
今プレゼンされましたよね。
はい、映像はですね、あれですよ、池田さんのね。
それでね、玉城さん、
これに入ったんですか？
あれがあるのかな。テープ。マリノあった？
マリノありましたよ。これを使ったやつ。どうします？私にこれ、
これ映るやつは、はい
はい、ありますよ。
やってきますよ。
そうでここはね、ここは4人。セグさんみたいな。亀谷さんと玉口さんいる。どっちでもいいんですよ。ニールだと出せる。椅子は全部12、椅子がない12ぐらい。いやいや、もうこれだから玉口さんのやつがこれはこれしかない。はい、これ使って。これも予備で後ろに置いて。
テープってセロテープ。
そうしたら玉城さんと亀谷さんは壇上でお話しいただけるかな。それで
亀谷さん、壇上で
お呼びしますので、あそこの台で。
壇上で上がるんですか。
そう、すみません。それで光がね出てくるので。で松尾さんはこれをしながら。
これ名前貼るやつ？うん、そう名前。これがの方がいいよ。
あった。
じゃあこっち来てましょうね、わかりやすいように。 これ借りてくる上に置いてからね。借りていい。誰のこれ？松島さんのじゃないな。松島さん。思考だと少し離れないとダメですよね。あとこれ取ったら。松島さん。はい。これは誰のかね。
俺の私の。
じゃあちょっと借りてください。
どうぞ。
あれもうみんな登壇するんですか。
いや今の時点は登壇しません。
まだ。
玉城さんはお座りになってください。亀さんが終わった時点で戻ってきますので、その時にそこから向こうに登壇お願いします。すみません。僕のやついいんです。今は隠れてますから。終わったらご案内しますから。はい。じゃあぼちしましょう。それでは、3時50分になりましたので休憩を終了し、後半のご発表に移りたいと思います。まず、亀谷正子さんの方から琉球民族の現状というタイトルでお話をいただきたいと思います。亀谷さん、よろしくお願いいたします。
皆さん、こんにちは。未来カナイぬ会の共同代表の一人、亀谷正子と申します。今日は暑い中、ご来場いただきありがとうございます。アメリカの人類学者をはじめ、日本の人類学者が参加する国際シンポジウムを琉球で初めて開催することになり、大変嬉しく思います。今回司会進行なさる太田好信九州大学名誉教授も、かつてアメリカの2つの大学に留学し、今回来留した人類学者たちと同じく3万人を超える人類学会に現在も所属なさっていると聞き及んでいます。さて、私たち未来カナイぬ会は、琉球から奪われた先人たちの遺骨を取り戻し、琉球民族の祭祀にのっとって弔うことを目的としています。1929年から33年にかけて、亡き人村ムムジャナバカから持ち去られた26体の遺骨返還を求めて、2018年12月に京都大学を提訴しました。そして12回にわたる裁判の結果、56歳の裁判長は自分の出世のために政府に忖度をして原告らを先住民族とみなさず、盗掘した事実にも言及せず、京都大学に遺骨の返還を命じませんでした。2008年に国連が琉球民族を先住民族と認定した後も、日本政府は国内の先住民族はアイヌ民族のみとして現在まで国連からの3度の勧告を受けるも、琉球民族を先住民族として認めていません。琉球国は1854年に琉米修好条約、1855年に琉仏修好条約、1859年に琉蘭修好条約を締結した独立国でしたが、1879年に明治政府による武力併合によって日本の植民地となり、3カ国との修好条約原本も琉球から持ち去られ、日本政府外務省が保管しています。1972年の日本復帰以降も、日本国内における米軍専有施設の 70% が 琉球に存続し、宜野湾市のど真ん中に位置する普天間基地を撤去することなく、日本政府は代替基地を琉球内に建設するとの計画を進め、2020年2月の辺野古への新基地建設に対する賛否の県民投票で 72% の反対が示されても、当時の防衛大臣は、沖縄には沖縄の民主主義があるが、日本政府には日本政府の民主主義があると発言しました。県民投票の目的は民意を知ることであり、示された結果を尊重するのが民主主義だと考えている私は、沖縄県民は日本国民とみなされていないとの怒りが湧き上がりました。これほど琉球人を侮蔑する言葉が政府高官から発せられるとは思いませんでした。近年は台湾有事が近いとの想定で、この南西諸島に奄美大島、宮古島、与那国島にミサイル基地を建設し、沖縄島、私の住むうるま市の自衛隊駐屯基地へのミサイル配備が予告されました。太平洋戦争で地上戦になり、住民の 25% が犠牲になり、また琉球語を話したことでスパイ扱いされて日本軍に惨殺された住民も数多く、すべての建物や公的首里城をはじめとする重要文化財が消失した惨禍がまたしても再現されようとしています。国防との名目で琉球の住民は日本を守るための盾となり、今はミサイル戦なので沖縄の中南部住民のほとんどが命を失うことになるでしょう。米中政治家には対話を通し、十分な意思疎通をして局地的な紛争防止にも努めてほしいと願うばかりです。さて、2019年に台湾から返還された63体の遺骨は、到着直後の未来かなえぬ会の4名の共同代表の再封送要望書を施行したにもかかわらず、重要な学術資料とするとして沖縄県埋蔵文化財センター倉庫に保管されていて、一体さえ公開せず、センター敷地内での慰霊さえも認めず、遺骨の収集場所も開示せず、私たち未来かなえぬ会は昨年1月に情報開示請求裁判を起こし、去る6月6日に結審を終え、9月28日には判決の運びとなっています。沖縄県の行政機関でありながら、沖縄県教育庁は琉球魂を失い、ひたすら文部科学省に顔を向けて4年余りも県民の知る権利を無視し続けてきました。遺骨研究のための倫理規定も作成せずに計測調査を行ったことも判明しています。今回のアメリカ人類学者の面談要望を拒否して文書による交渉を受け入れました。先住民の人権を尊重するアメリカ人類学者の説明が沖縄県教育庁職員の心に届くよう願っています。先住民族の遺骨副葬品の返還は1990年のアメリカに始まり、オーストラリアとイギリスが続き、今やヨーロッパ諸国に広がる国際潮流となっています。今年5月7日の北海道新聞にカラフトアイヌの遺骨4体がオーストラリアから日本に返還された記事がありました。日本が先進国 G7 のメンバーとして 同じ価値観を共有するのは一体いつになるでしょうか。私は京都大学裁判原告の一人で、大阪高等裁判所で第二審を戦っていますが、裁判長が傍聴席からのやじにも検討しますと返事をする誠実さ、先住民族遺骨返還の国際的潮流を認識していれば、その人間性、裁判長の人間性、すなわち誠実な人柄であるかどうかが判決に現れると今回は期待しています。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
亀谷さん、どうもありがとうございました。それでは続きまして、玉城剛さんによるご発表をお願いします。台湾大学から沖縄教育、委員会に移管された63体のご遺骨の情報開示訴訟という題目で、講演をお願いします。
ぐすうよ昼夜いい天気やいびいたしがあちさチャーナといびがやむる健康やいうタムチョイビーがや、皆さんご集まりいただきありがとうございます。今紹介されたように沖縄県教育委員会の、保管するご遺骨について、訴訟が起きております。訴訟を起こしましたので、この二代家内の会でですね、それを説明いたします。現在、すいません、私の何ですかね、意見書をご覧ください。現在行っている情報開示請求訴訟は2019年3月18日に台湾大学から沖縄県教育委員会に移管された63体のご遺骨を元の場所に戻すための一連の取り組みです。63体のご遺骨は1929年金関武雄京都帝国大学助教授が琉球より盗骨したものです。二来家内の会は2019年3月26日に要望書を提出し、ご遺骨を元の場所に戻すよう要求しました。沖縄県教育委員会は沖縄の歴史にかかる貴重な資料なので、今後も継続して研究材料、ものとして取り扱うと回答しました。その後3年にわたり、交渉してきましたが、沖縄県教育委員会は全く方針を変えていません。遺骨に関する重要情報も一部黒塗りにして不開示にしています。このままでは返還請求訴訟もできません。確かな情報を得て遺骨返還請求を提起するために2022年1月25日に情報開示請求訴訟を起こしました。以下違法な不開示について、弁護団による明快な指摘と説明を述べます。一部不開示資料は沖縄人遺骨、これは人骨と書いてありますけど、本当はね遺骨ですよねの確認移管研修書添付1移管台帳と当初予算等説明書当初歳出予算見積書です。移管研修書添付1移管台帳の不開示決定について、理由とその不当性を述べます。下1から5まで書いてありますが、1から5までこれら順次説明します。1、不開示理由開示すると関係者から返還請求訴訟を提起されるから、不開示にしないということについて、説明します。当初、被告は教育委員会は関係者から、 返還請求訴訟を提起されるから不開示としたが、しかし、訴訟物を特定できなくなったということはないため、それと、訴訟物は特定できなくなったということはないということは訴訟できるというんですね。訴訟を提起できなくなるということもないと後から述べていて矛盾が生じています。返還請求訴訟を提起されるという理由で不開示にする根拠はなくなりました。原告の裁判を受ける権利を侵害する目的でなされた本件処分は憲法32条の趣旨に違反するものであり、沖縄県情報公開条例を著し乱用するものであるから違法行為です。2、不開示理由、対応する職員と調査研究を行う職員が同一であるので、調査研究に潜入できない、萎縮してしまうという理由について、訴訟が提起された場合に対応する職員の人数、要する時間の見通しなどはいずれも明確に説明されていません。本件訴訟に対する被告の態度を見るに、被告が行う調査研究に支障を及ぼすほどの対応が必要になることはおよそ考えられないと弁護士は言っております。3章ですね、被告は、口頭弁論期日に一度も出廷していない被告準備書面における主張の誤りがあります。書面の検討や確認を全く行ってないと考えられます。迅速な対応を行っている様子は一切見られません。被告の訴訟追考態度に照らせば、原告の共同代表が遺骨の返還を求める訴訟を提起したとしても、調査研究に費やす時間が削られるほどの負担が生じることはおよそ考えられないと弁護士さんは言っております。3、不開示理由、調査研究に関する事務の公正かつ能率的な遂行を不当に阻害する恐れがあるについて、遺骨の収集場所に利害関係を有する者たちからの要望が増え、職員が同一であるので調査研究に専念できない、それから事務の公正かつ能率的な遂行を不当に阻害する恐れがあると主張します。本件処分は、不開示の処分は憲法16条に反するものであり、沖縄県情報公開条例を著しく乱用するものであるから違法です。当該文書には詳細な情報が記載されていない、いわゆる住所とかそういうのも載ってないんですね。それから黒塗り資料を公開したからといって要望が出る可能性は象徴的なものに過ぎません。情報がなんていうんですか、大雑把なのでね、関係者を特定することはできないということなんですね。要望は憲法を根拠とする不当な行為であるから、ごめんなさい、正当な行為であるから、私たちの要望はですね、正当な行為であるから、不当に阻害する恐れは生じないということですね。被告は公文書開示義務を履行すべく体制を整えるべきであって、対応職員不足を不開示処分の根拠にすることは許されません。4、不開示理由、当該情報が誤っていたと判明した場合には、県民に混乱を招き、調査研究に費やす時間が削られること等を防止するために不開示にしたことについて、被告は収集場所は未確定な情報であるところ、 県民は当該情報が真実であると認識するから、当該情報が誤っていたと判明した場合には、県民に混乱を招き、事務の公正かつ能率的な遂行を不当に阻害する恐れがあると主張しました。収集場所は国立台湾大学医学院が記載したものであるから、国立台湾大学医学院が把握している情報であることを説明することによって、国民の混乱は防ぐことができるのです。被告の主張は抽象的な可能性を言うものに過ぎないので、不開示理由の根拠にはならない。5、不開示理由根拠資料を有していないために対応することはできないの理由について、被告は確定した根拠資料を有していないため、県民から説明を求められても対応することはできないから、調査研究をした結果の修正も困難が伴う。その後の研究にも支障をきたす、という被告の主張はおよそ理解不能である。根拠資料を有していないと説明すれば良いだけで、研究に支障をきたすことはないということですね。次に、本件当初予算と説明書、と当初予算見積書の不開示について話します。2021年事業別再事業別概要説明書、2021年、事業別概算見積書、沖縄県教育委員会は下記の通り一部不開示処分を行った。不開示理由がですね、県が実施する調査研究の適正な遂行に支障を及ぼす恐れがあるため開示しないとしました。被告は研究機関名と調査先、都道府県名が記載されていると、原告共同代表らが、調査先に対して、遺骨について問い合わせは意見表明などを行う恐れがあり、資料の所有者が協力を拒むことがあれば、調査の目的を達成することができなくなると主張しています。添付資料の最後の方にですね、こういう資料が載ってます。そこにですね、小さく黒く塗られているのがありますが、これが県を表しているですね、黒く塗られております。時間もないのですぐ急ぎます。調査先が教育委員会への協力を断ることなどのいずれも単なる抽象的な可能性を言うに過ぎないと。よって本会不開示部分は本件条例7条7号を適用することはできない。情報開示請求訴訟は沖縄県教育委員会が自ら琉球人の権利を放棄する行為を止める裁判です。不当で違法な情報の不開示を弁護団とともに解明し追及しています。なお、当裁判の判決は9月28日に出されます。皆様の傍聴をお願いいたします。以上です。
はい、玉口さん、どうもありがとうございました。それでは次のご発表者、増島康和さんに、民族の自己決定権による遺骨返還運動という題目でお話を伺いたいと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。
はいさい、中華ラビラ、ワンデマスメスカツヤイビユタサルグトゥニゲサビラ。1929年から35年の間、京都帝国大学の金杉武雄三宅宗悦、中山英二らは植民地支配下における日本人と琉球人との不平等な 関係性を利用して、琉球諸島や奄美諸島から遺骨を頭骨し、研究を行ってきました。私はですね、1996年に国連先住民作業部会、2011年には国連脱植民地化特別委員会、2020年と22年に国連先住民族の権利に関する専門家機構で報告し、世界の先住民族と交流して脱植民地化のための運動の輪を広げてきました。1996年から2020年まで80人以上の琉球民族が先住民族の権利に関する国連宣言の草案起草の場であった国連先住民作業部会をはじめ、国連の各種委員会に参加し報告いたしました。去年はですね、今日も来ている具志堅高松さんも一緒でしたけども、その結果ですね、2008年に国連自由権規約委員会、2018年に国連人種差別撤廃委員会、2022年に国連自由権規約委員会、2023年、今年ですね、国連人権理事会は、琉球民族を先住民族として認めるよう日本政府に勧告いたしました。しかし、日本政府は琉球民族を先住民族として認めようとしておりません。日本政府が先住民族と認めないのは、先住民族の権利に関する国連宣言30条、軍事活動の禁止違反となり、日米両軍の軍事基地の押し付けという植民地支配政策の実施ができないからであると考えられます。しかし、日本政府が先住民族として認識姉妹がILO169 号条約に基づき、琉球民族は先住民族になり、国連宣言の適用対象になることができます。2017年1月、私は琉球先住民族の遺骨が京都大学に保管されていることを知り、同年4月から京大に対して遺骨返還運動を始めました。しかし、京大は私との対話を拒否し、遺骨についても質問にも答えませんでした。よって2018年12月、遺骨返還を求めて京大を京都地裁に提訴いたしました。2019年7月、日本人類学会の篠田健一会長、これはすみません、去年のですね、模様でしたけれども、左側がですね、日本人類学会の篠田健一、前会長、右側が山際久和京大前学長ですけれども、がですね、宛てに次のような文言を含む要望書を送付しました。国内の遺跡等から収集され保管されている個人骨は、その地域の先人の姿、生活の様式を明らかにするための学問的価値を持つ国民共有の文化財として将来にわたり保存継続継承され研究に供与されるべきである。また、引用ですけれども、個人骨資料の管理につきましては、今後さまざまな運動が発生するかもしれませんけれども、100年または200年先、あるいはさらに遠い将来を見据えながら、国民共有の文化財という認識に基づいて対応を取っていただきたいと考えます。引用終わり。日本人を主体とする国民共有の財産として琉球民族の遺骨は、どのような遺骨返還運動があろうが研究対象として利用されなければならないとする日本人類学会の植民地主義、帝国主義がこの要望書からも明らかであります。2022年4月、京都地裁は被告勝訴の判決を出したため、現在大阪高裁で控訴審を戦っています。大阪高裁の裁判長は、遺骨が保管されている京都大学総合博物館に行って状況を確認したいと求めましたけれども、京大は頑くなに拒否してきました。で、競技進行において京大は26体の遺骨の写真をやっと提示しました。しかし全ての頭蓋骨が上下逆さまであり、後頭部のみ撮影した写真でありました。琉球民族は遺骨を不二神とし、ご先祖に対して礼を尽くします。仏壇やお墓に花や果物を備え、お茶等をします。京大は遺骨に供物を捧げないばかりか、全ての頭蓋骨を逆さにして保管しています。人類学者はどこから盗んだ遺骨かが分かるよう、頭蓋骨に牧書をいたします。2019年3月に国立台湾大学から沖縄県埋蔵文化財センターに移管された金関武雄が盗んだ63体の頭蓋骨にもですね、琉球運転という文字が牧書されています。しかし、京大が出してきた写真はそのような牧書が見えないような角度で撮影されていました。京大が裁判官による、博物館での実地見分を拒否するのは、遺族の気持ちを逆なでするような反倫理的な方法で遺骨を保管しているからではないかと考えられます。そこでですね、京大が出してきた写真、私たちのご先祖の写真をですね、 少し、お見せしたいと思いますが、写真の撮影はお控えください。まだ、これ裁判資料となっております。すべて頭蓋骨は逆さま、ものとして扱われているということは分かります。でですね、沖縄県教育庁がまとめた沖縄の創生に関する総合調査っていうですね、学術報告書がありまして、その中でですね、例えば今帰仁村中曽根では、仙骨の後ですね、頭蓋骨からも先に洗うと。で、亀に逗子亀ですね、収めるときは足の骨から順序入れて、頭蓋骨は最後に収めると。で、頭蓋骨を太陽に当てないように傘をさしてですね、貼ってで入れると。そして夫婦は一つの亀に収めると。で、読谷村そべではですね、すべての骨を洗い終えると、地石亀、逗子亀に足の骨から入れて、頭蓋骨は一番上に置くと。で、逗子亀は、墓の段の上に安置すると。で、逗子亀の方向は入り口の方向に逗子亀、頭蓋骨を向けると。で、富城区マダン橋ではですね、頭蓋骨は最も必要に近いものが抱いて持つ。遺骨に日光を当てないよう黒傘を刺して行う。逗子亀には足の骨から収めて、頭蓋骨は上にする。収めるときは3人で足の骨を3回橋渡しする。などなどですね、が決められております。で、これから言えることはですね、琉球民族の尊厳、慣習、先祖との関係性をですね、否定するような取り扱いを強大しているということが分かるわけですね。足の骨から下の上から順にですね、頭子亀に収めていく。で、最後に頭蓋骨を置く。つまり、生きてる人間と同じような身体の位置をですね、亀の中に再現し、未来家内という琉球民族の祖先が住む次の世での生活を準備するというですね、意味が、逗子亀でのね、祭り方にあるわけです。それを兄弟は破壊している。で、夫婦は未来家内でも一緒に生活するという願いに対して、個別の遺骨を保管することで、夫婦、または親子の関係を兄弟は分断させています。で、また頭蓋骨は死後も、市民祭、16歳などを通じて墓前で子孫と対面するために、前向きに置かれますけれども、しかし、写真の頭蓋骨はすべて後ろ向きで、上下逆さまです。兄弟は頭蓋骨を標本として扱い、琉球民族の尊厳を否定し、先祖と子孫との関係を切断しています。また、この写真はですね、フラッシュ、強い、室内等を当てて、撮影しており、遺骨には太陽の光、つまり光を当てないという琉球民族慣習も、兄弟は否定しているということが分かります。また、兄弟はですね、大阪高裁における控訴審の準備書面において、原告、亀谷正子さん、玉城区剛さんが、第一少子の子孫とは言えないというまでも述べています。で、琉球民族は家父、または逗子亀の蓋の牧師などによって先祖の関係や記憶を確認し、アイデンティティを形成してきました。これ写真のあるようとですね、お二人のものです。で、琉球の慣習法を兄弟が非科学的であると無視し、遺骨の保管の法的根拠を示すことなく、トーク物の研究を特権化しています。先祖との関係性を通じて、琉球の歴史や記憶や文化を継承し、ルーツを自覚するという民族意識の形成のプロセスを兄弟は否定しています。自分たち研究者がゲノム研究や検査研究によって亀谷さんや為口さんの先祖を特定できる。だから返しません。返さない。で、琉球の歴史は自分たちの兄弟研究者が解明できるのだと兄弟は言いたいのでありましょう。これは逗子亀の裏ですね。で、この人はですね、2020年に、MBS というテレビ番組で出てきた人で、現在の日本人類学会の会長の中塚正人兄弟教授です。で、彼はですね、この人骨研究は自分の知的好奇心に基づいてやってるというふうに、もう恥じげもなく言ったんですね。で、中塚会長は琉球民族の先祖に対する畏敬や信仰、慣習などよりも、自らの知的好奇心を優先し、研究倫理を問う遺族としての対応との対話を拒否して、これからも半永久的にいわゆる人骨研究を続けようとしているというふうに言えるかと思います。次のですね、ことは、1971年、復帰前のことなんですけれども、引用なんですが、最近、墓荒らしの被害が続いているのは、宮古島、石垣島、久高島、西表島などのいわゆる民族学資料の宝庫といわれる島々、およそ3年ばかり前から、本土の大学や民間の研究者が沖縄の島々にどっと乗り込んできた。珍しい生活様式、文化遺産は一つ一つ貴重な研究資料になった。つい8月にも沖縄民族学の父といわれる故柳生氏の浦添具宿跡にある墓が暴かれる事件があったが、 故伊橋も最近とんでもない民具ブームを嘆いておられるだろう。伊橋のですね、骨は草むらに捨てられて壺が盗まれたということで、伊橋の墓ですけどもですね、でこの、東が左側、右側鳥居隆三ですが、1904年、伊波はですね、東京帝国大学の人類学者鳥居隆三が琉球調査をしたときに案内役を務めました。鳥居は琉球で写真を撮影し、蓄音機で琉球書語などを録音し、そして中城後から、数十体もの遺骨を琉球の遺骨を盗みました。で1928年には金崎武雄が琉球に行く前に伊波は人口収集に関する金崎からの問い合わせに答えています。同胞の遺骨が日本人研究者により盗まれることに何ら痛みをも感じなかったと考えられます。琉球民族の信仰、慣習、生活よりも自分の研究や知識、好奇心、研究者ネットワークを伊波は重視していたと言えます。研究者による墓荒らしは戦前には鳥居隆三、清野賢治、金崎武雄、宮城宗一だけではなく、日本復帰、今から51年前の日本復帰前後においてもですね、問題化していました。墓荒らしの犯人は形質人類学者だけでなく、厨子亀、副葬品等を研究対象にする他分野の研究者もいました。戦中戦後にかけて琉球の遺骨や文化財は植民者としての米軍人によっても盗まれており、それらの返還運動が行政民間によって行われてきました。1854年、マシュー・ペリー一行は琉球から五国寺の鐘をアメリカに持ち出し、アナポリス海軍兵学校が保管していました。でそして1987年に岸場静雄氏が、この鐘を琉球に返還させました。また米兵はですね、オモロソウシ、消化バウンとかバンコク診療の鐘もですね、戦後、盗んだんですけども、戦後琉球民族が返還させました。沖縄美ら島財団や沖縄県教育委員会は2001年、琉球国王の王冠と13点の流出文化財を FBI の国際盗難美術ファイルに登録させて、今その捜査を行っています。でまたペリー一行はですね、2体分の琉球民族遺骨を持ち出し、現在ペンシルベニア大学考古学人類学博物館でモートンコレクションの一部として保管しております。現在その返還運動がウカンシーカブダン、在ハワイ琉球民族で今日発表されたエドワード・ハレアロハ・アヤウさんで未来からの会で行われているということでございます。でこのサムエル・ジョージ・モートンという人は、世界中から、1000体、先ほど話した1300体以上の頭蓋骨を収集し、頭蓋骨の大きさによって人間の優劣を決定した人種差別主義者です。つまり琉球民族遺骨も人種差別研究の今対象になっているわけなんですね。これがペンシルベニア大学に保管されている琉球人の遺骨のですね、人骨標本台帳ですけども、で遺骨の返還という我々の墓を今用意しております。亀谷さんのお墓ですけどもですね。で次ですが、国立民族博物館、これは大阪にありますけどもの標本資料目録データベースで沖縄を入力するとですね、1327件が出てきた。そのうち厨子亀が11件、骨壺が3件出てきました。でその全てが1975年に博物館に受け入れられたと記載されています。でこの琉球由来の文化財の民族分類項目は他の沖縄県の標本と同じく日本ジャパンと記載されている。他方アイヌの民族分類項目はアイヌと記載されています。以上の事実から、次のことが言えます。文化人類学者が琉球民族を日本民族と分類定義しており、これはアイデンティティ搾取の問題です。非植民者の琉球民族の民族的属性を人類学の国家機関に決めつけています。琉球先住民族否定という日本政府の国策と符合しており、民泊は国策の実施機関として機能していると言えます。ILO169 号条約のように民族アイデンティティは他者によってではなく民族自身の自覚に基づいて形成されるという先住民族による国際的な了解があります。どのような文化人類学的研究に基づいて琉球民族のを日本民族として分類定義されるかを説明する社会的責任がありますけれども、それも明示されておりません。で遺骨と厨子亀は一体化しており、それを切り離すことは琉球民族に対する学問の暴力となります。例えばですね、厨子亀の蓋には次のような死者に関する記憶、歴史が記載されています。これは、 次の文章はですね、金月のものなんですけれども、金月は亡くしてからですね、比嘉さんで母と子ので遺骨を盗んだわけなんですけれども、そういったことが書かれております。で最後、まとめですけれども、琉球民族遺骨返還請求訴訟は日本の法廷において初めて、教団に対して琉球民族の遺骨返還を求め、琉球に対する日本の植民地支配の歴史を批判し、負債の方法に基づいて先住民族が有する遺骨返還権を主張したものです。その結果、京都地裁は判決文において被告を琉球民族と記載し、兄弟は琉球福祉科研究所が収集した、また盗掘した遺骨の保管事実を認め、遺骨や収蔵庫の写真を公開しました。今年6月4日にですね、広島市で行われた日本文化人類学会の大会の場所においてですね、民泊の人類学者が私に対してですね、保管している民泊が保管している土紙のすべて琉球に返すというふうに約束いたしました。琉球先住民族の遺骨の返還は世界的な潮流になっています。これまでの報告で分かります。しかし、この問題に対しても日本の学士は鎖国的な対応を取り、研究者なら関わらずも許されると言わんばかりのですね、ばかりに研究者の特権を振りかざし、自らの抵抗資料を総括しようとしていません。琉球民族の遺骨、樹脂亀、副葬品等の返還は、日米両軍の基地建設阻止運動とともに、琉球の脱植民地化のための民族の自己決定権の行使であります。世界の先住民族も国内での戦いを国連、国際人権 NGO との連携を通じて広げて強化してきました。琉球民族も自らの身体や精神を縛る抵抗の鎖を断ち切り、先祖との絆を結び直してきたというふうに考えます。イペネフ・デイビタン、Thank you very much。ありがとうございました。
はい、増島さん、どうもありがとうございました。ですね、これからは、質疑応答の時間になります。お断りしておきたいのは、実はこの会場、ご覧の通り、同時通訳の施設、それからもろもろの機材の撤収等々にですね、かなり時間を要するものと見られます。そこで、この会議はですね、一応5時30分終了という予定だったんですが、今述べたような理由によりですね、少し早めの撤収を考えております。しかしながら、およそ30分、35分間はですね、フロアの皆様、それから Zoom で参加していらっしゃる皆様との間で、若干の質疑応答の時間が取れると思います。で、そこで、Zoom で参加している先ほど、その前に、じゃあ講演者の方々は前の方に来ていただけますでしょうか。Could you please all these the participants come up to the podium and up on the stage? 先ほど話題になったハワイ、ホノルル州で活動をなさっているエリック和田さんと、Zoom でつながっているので、和田さんの方から、数分ですね、5分間ほど、お話を伺いたいと思います。和田さん、いかがでしょうか。
はい、それ。
はいはいはい。
ブシチャターバーのマタマが、中本グルのマタマがまだエリックやいホノルルまで、ハワイうちなんちゅう4世いたさることに言えさびら。今ハワイで私たちが一応もうとっても沖縄のサポートをしてますので、あとハレアロハ先生の手伝いで今はペントベニア大学でまた琉球の遺骨があることを見つかって、それをまたうちなんかい戻って抜くと一応運動やってますので、みんなと一緒に
多芸に作らない野菜。
よろしいですか。もしもし。
はいはい
はい、どうも、大丈夫、もうよろしいですかね。ありがとうございます。素晴らしいメッセージありがとうございました。
エリックさん、どうもありがとうございました。それでは会場にはですね、先ほど松間さんからもお話があった具志堅高松さんがいらっしゃるので、具志堅さんの活動と今回の遺骨返還についての関係性等々についてですね、少しまたお話を伺いたいと思います。いいと思います。はい、すみません、具志堅さんよろしくお願いいたします。
はい、ありがとうございます。具志堅です。遺骨収集ボランティアガマフェアの代表をやっております。今日のお話の中で遺骨収集というか、私も普段の活動で遺骨に接しているもんですから、非常になんていうんですか、共感できる部分がたくさんありました。で話したいことっていくつかあるんですけども、今ちょっと心配していることが一つありまして、それはアイヌの方たちが遺骨を返してくれ、コタンに返してくれ、要するにコタンっていうのはアイヌの村なんですけども、でアイヌの村に再埋葬したいから返してくれっていうふうなことを言う、そういう主張を展開していまして、一部帰ったんですけれども、多くのアイヌの遺骨がですね、再埋葬するんじゃなくて、北海道の白老町っていうところにウポポイっていう施設ができたんですよ。その施設がどういうものかっていうと、アイヌの文化を伝える施設っていうことと、あとその遺骨をですね、慰霊と研究のための施設だっていうんです。アイヌの遺骨を、要するに盗まれたアイヌの遺骨を返しますけども、それはウポポイという施設に返し入れます。そこは慰霊と研究の施設っていうんですよ。慰霊だけじゃないんですよ。それが研究施設なんです。それがもうすでにできてしまってるんですね。それが沖縄にもできるんじゃないかということを心配しています。皆さん最近聞いたことないですかね。国立自然博物館、多分その名称でいいですよね。国立自然博物館っていうのを沖縄にできるっていうふうな作ろうとしている動きがあるんですよ。そこに台湾から帰ってきた36人のごめんなさい、63人のうちなんちゅの遺骨が入るんじゃないかな、収められてしまうんじゃないか。本来は元あった場所に帰るべきなのに、それを慰霊の施設とかっていうふうな、慰霊と研究を一緒にするような施設を作って、そこに収められるんじゃないかっていうふうなことを心配しています。これはうちなんちゅがその自分たちのウヤファーフジをどう考えるかっていうことが問われることだと思ってるんですよ。国がそういう施設を作ってそこに収められるんだったらば、それはいいことだって考えるのか、それとも一度葬られた家族によって葬られた方たちを葬った場所から盗み出されて国が作った別の施設に入れていいのか、本来であれば元の場所に戻すべきじゃないかっていうふうな、それを皆さん考えるときにですね、それが自分のお墓から持っていかれたものだったらどうあるべきかっていうふうに考えたら分かりやすいかと思います。これから先その国立自然博物館っていうのができるっていうことになったときに、私たちはもしその 沖縄から盗まれた私たちの先祖の骨がそこに入れられるっていうふうになったらば、私たちそれに対して声を上げる必要があると思ってます。とりあえず今それだけを言います。
具志堅さん、ありがとうございました。今出てきた北海道白老の施設についてですね、おそらくこの会場で最もお詳しいのは、加藤博文さんだと思うので、加藤さんからちょっと一言コメントをお願いできますでしょうか。ご意見。
はい、北海道大学の加藤です。コメントですか。はい。北海道、今お話があったその北海道の白老町にできた施設というのは、正確に言うと2つの、1つはですね、民族共生象徴空間という空間なんですが、それは2つの組織で作られています。1つは公園、もう1つは国立の博物館です。で、国立の博物館は国立アイヌ民族博物館という名前がついています。で、今具志堅さんの方でおっしゃられたその国の慰霊施設というのは公園の中の一部に作られているんですね。ただそれは、多くの観光客の方が届く公園の中にはありません。少し離れた丘の上に作られています。で、そこでは、毎年、慰霊祭が行われています。で、なぜそこに、アイヌの祖先の人たちの遺骨が、納められることになったかというと、その背景には実はもともとはそれは日本中の12の大学に保管されていたアイヌ民族の祖先の遺骨なんですね。ところがそれが、返還の動きが出てきたときに、過去のずさんな研究のために実はどこから掘り出されたのかがわからないという遺骨がたくさん含まれています。それからもう一つは、先ほど具志堅さんがおっしゃられたこととも関わるんですが、一度埋葬された遺骨が、もう一度掘り出されるということは、実はアイヌの人たちの中には想定していなかったんですね。つまり一度埋葬したものをもう一度また再埋葬するということは全く理解できないというふうに考えて、返還を考えていないコミュニティというのもあります。そういった複雑な状況があって、慰霊施設の中に多くのアイヌの祖先の人たちの遺骨が残される状況が起きています。一応国はですね、この施設は一時的な施設であって、最終的には地域に戻るのが本来の目的であるというふうには言っています。ただ、確かにおっしゃられたように、一応国では慰霊施設の中では研究ができないことになっているんですが、そこから持ち出された場合に、その遺骨が施設の外に持ち出された場合には、研究に使われる可能性がゼロではありません。なので、一番大事なのはやはりアイヌ民族の祖先の遺骨に関しては、アイヌ民族側がやはりしっかりと自分たちの祖先を慰霊の対象としてどう扱いたいのかということを主張していくこと、国とか大学とか研究者が遺骨を管理するのではなくて、アイヌ民族が祖先の遺骨を管理し、自分たちで判断し、慰霊の対象にするということがこれからも大事になるんだろうと思います。まだそういった議論は始まったばかりで、しかし今後も周りはそれをきちんと注視していく必要性があると思います。このようなところでよろしいでしょうか。
加藤さん、どうもありがとうございました。詳しいお話。実はここに前の方に、座っていただいているニール・タシマさん、キャスリン、クレインさん、それから、サブリナ・アガワルさん、それからマイケル・ブレイキーさん、この4名の方々はここに来る前にですね、今月上旬、7月の正確に7月の2日ですが、白老町の慰霊施設も訪問していますので、今のお話を踏まえてですね、一言、ご意見を伺えればなと思うんですが、マイケル・ブレイキーさんいかがでしょうか。アグワルさんどうでしょうか。
So thank you, Professor Kato. And we spent several days in Professor Kato's center and speaking with Ainu representatives. I certainly think he characterizes the situation which he knows very well as we saw it. It's very clear that the Ainu are reasonably angry and are demanding as a first step for the return of stolen remains an apology. That seems to be a very firm position that they hold against an apparently so far intransigent, unmoved anthropological research institutions.
Yes, like Michael noted, the most important thing that we have heard is the first apology and then return. The memorial is at least a step in the right direction, a place to honor these ancestors, but I can understand the concern that it will not be, it's like another institution. All of these ancestors being brought in one place is like another large museum. So they have to be honored in the appropriate ways.
ありがとうございました。田島さん、クレインさん、何かございますか。
少しだけ。I think what impressed me about both the Ainu and the Ryukun people we've spoken with is the constancy of why change needs to happen, and why responsibility being taken by community is the only way for that change to happen.
I agree with him.
わかりました。おそらく具志堅さんのお話をちょっとだけ広げるとすればですね、子孫となる人たち、おそらくここに住んでいる人たちはどのように自分を自己肯定するのかということに関わっていると思うんですが、その人たちが自分の先祖をどう考えるか、先祖の遺骨が盗まれるという不正義があったときに、自分たちが責任を感じ、それを取り戻そうとするのかどうか、そして先ほどあったように、それを盗んでいったそれというのは遺骨ですね、その科学者たちが感じる過去の不正義への是正というのは2つの意味で、責任という言葉がですね解釈されると思うので、ここはそうすると、多くの人たちがですね、共に関わり、このような過去の不正義をですね、是正するように共に動ける点ではないかなとも思っています。これからですね、さらにフロアの方にですね、まだ多様なご意見があると思います。お伺いしたいんですが、ご意見のある方はぜひ手を挙げてください。マイクロフォンを持ってですね、そちらの方に伺います。同じようにZoom でご参加の方々にもですね、意見があればぜひ挙手機能でお知らせください。
与那嶺と申します。いろいろと有益なお話、大変参考になりました。ありがとうございました。私はまず遺骨問題はですね、非常に簡単に合理的に考えるんですけども、もし無謀じゃなばかにそのまま置いてたら、もう自然風化に任せるばかりですよね。それよりも暖房とか湿度とか温度がしっかり管理されたちゃんとしたところに、しかもそれらしいなんて言いますかね、それらしい雰囲気の場所を作ってですね、で保管すれば ただ長く保存はできるなと。で1年に何回かは里帰りという意味で元のブージャラバカに、戻していただいて、そこで子孫が拝むようにしたら沖縄の人の宝も長続きするし、子孫の、尊敬の念も叶えられるし、一挙両得じゃないかなと思っていますけど、すいません。
はい、ありがとうございます、皆さん。これはやはりまずは子孫であるところの方からご意見を伺い、それから今フロアの方で手が挙がっている具志堅さんの方に意見をということに意見をお伺いしたいと思います。
私は第一少子の子孫となっています。ただやっぱり琉球は昔から祖先崇拝の国だと言われてまして、お骨を遺骨を不二神としてそこに神様が宿るということで、私の友達はすごく霊感の強い人ですと、沖縄でいう、ユタですか、それもできる方なんですけど、やっぱりこの昔の先人たちが今この人の神様となっているんですよね。そういうつながりっていうからありますけど、で私の場合は考えますと、京都大が温室管理完璧にして、それはそのままほっとくよりは長持ちしますけど、子孫としてはその完璧にして長持ちしてほしいんではなくて、従来の方法で自然劣化に任せる、これが一番だと私は思います。人工的に工夫して長持ちさせるということにはあまり意味はないと思います。
はい、今ですね、保管が長らくできるようにということなんですけども、ご遺骨は保管するものではないんですよね。自分のお墓に行って、安寧にして、そして過ごしていくというのがご先祖の意思であって、私たち生きてる人間の都合で効率よく何かをしようという、そういうものではないので、そういうふうに考えております。
金井さん、玉口さん、ありがとうございます。それでは先ほどから手が挙がっている、具志堅さんにもう一言じゃあお願いいたしましょう。
はい、今玉口さんが言われたことにもうそれに尽きると思います。私はお墓の中っていうのは遺骨を未来永劫残すものじゃなくて土に返すところだと思ってるんですね。皆さんご存知と思いますけども、骨壺に入ってる遺骨でも33年過ぎたら一番奥の池に全部こぼして、それを土に返していきますよね。私沖縄のこのお墓っていうか葬送儀礼っていうのはとっても洗練されたものだと思ってるんですよ。まず亡くなったら火葬するとかではなくて、そのまま自然に骨になるまで5年なり7年なり置いといて、でそれをきれいに剪骨して、それから骨壺に収めて、でそのお墓を子孫が毎年シーミーをやったりとか、亡くなった人と一緒に子孫が繁栄していることを報告するっていうか、一緒に暮らしてるっていうことが確認する場所だと思ってるし、でそこでなんていうんですか、先祖と共に土に帰っていくっていう風な、沖縄の土になるんだっていう風な、私はこれは非常に洗練された素敵な葬送儀礼だと思いますし、で私が遺骨収集をやって家族の 元へ返したいっていうのも、その両親のお墓に戻してあげたいんですよ、その沖縄で亡くなった方を。でその方たちは家族によってまだお葬式もしてもらってないし、ご遺族に戻してその両親先祖のお墓の中で初めて安らぐことができると思って、それで遺骨収集をやって家族の元へ返すのを目的にやってるというつもりです。すいません、説明になったかどうか。はい、以上です。
具志堅さん、ありがとうございます。おそらくこの、死者と共にあった副葬品もそうなんですけれども、遺骨とともにこれらを土に返すということで、私の頭にパーッと上ったのは、そのような返還に携わったことがある、チップ・コーレルさんがいらっしゃるので、一言コーレルさんからご経験、それからご意見ちょっと伺いたいと思うんですが。
I just might add that I think the core concept goes back to what Halealoha said, which is consent. And so it's important for the museum administrators, for the government agents, whoever is involved, to seek the consent of different communities. And even when there's a diversity of opinion, doing their best to facilitate a conversation so there's consensus about what to do. And what I've seen in the United States with many Native communities is there's not one solution. For example, there's a tribe in Oklahoma called the Cheyenne, and in some cases they have done scientific studies in collaboration with the scientists before repatriation, and sometimes very extensive scientific studies. But it's done in consent and in collaboration with the descendants. In other cases, I've worked with the Zuni tribe in New Mexico, and they believe that the damage that has been done to their ancestors when they were robbed from their graves is so detrimental to the spiritual health of the land that it's more dangerous to bring those ancestors back to the reservation than it is to leave them in museums. And so in some cases, the tribe has actually asked for the museum to continue to hold those ancestors until they can find a safe way to bring them home. And then other tribes simply want their ancestors back in the land, back home, with no study, with no additional work done, and for them that is the right thing to do. So there doesn't have to, in my view, what I've seen is that there is not one solution. Repatriation is not one process. It's very complex and dependent upon what the community itself is asking the institution as a way to make amends, as a way to heal the wounds of history.
アラレアさんも一言いかがでしょうか、今の課題について。
On the same issue, as we've all stated, repatriation is really family matters. But we have someone sitting at the family table who's controlling the business of the family and doing something the family does not want. When the family does want studies, and that's happened in our community, those were done. And that's what Professor Blakey was expressing very eloquently about informed consent. Informed, meaning we know beforehand that you want to do it, and then permission is given. Too many times, it's done without permission. And for us, when it's done as part of the repatriation process, we ask that they also repatriate the information they took from the EV. Because it wasn't given It wasn't taken with our permission, but it was part of the repatriation process. And we asked that that be returned because that belongs to the kupuna. Being in the form of Evie in bone is the most naked you can be. And so there's shame involved when somebody's looking at you, when somebody has a light on you, when somebody's measuring you. And we reconcile with our kupuna. We apologize that we were not able to prevent that from happening, but it was necessary to get them home. And now that they're home, hopefully they can heal from what happened. We know that they hurt because we hurt. Because we, every single one of us, are our ancestors. Yeah? We are the sum of all of our kupuna. And when they're disturbed, we're disturbed. When we are able to bring them home and rebury them and reconcile that hurt, then we can have that kind of healing. That's the importance of the work we do. So that we don't leave this problem to our children and future generations. I agree with Chip, this is going to take a long time. We've been at it for 33 years and we still have no idea on how we're doing because we have no idea how extensive the problem is. But repatriation allows restoration of our humanity, but it also allows the restoration of the humanity of those at the museums taking responsibility for these acts. That is, shared humanity is our only hope going forward to make sure that we can all heal from this colonial violence. Mahalo.
ハレアロハさんがおそらく今までの議論かなり濃厚にまとめて、くださったと思うんですが、一方から見ればこの遺骨が盗まれたというのは子孫の方としてはそれが起きてしまったことに対する恥じらいがあると、先祖に対するですね、これは。ですからそれを自分たちの力で自分たちの手でこれを取り返すんだというそういうその子孫とそれから先祖との関係があると、これは一つとても大切なことのような気がいたします。私のではすみません、真ん中の方から手が挙がっています。それからその次後ろの方へというふうに。
皆さん、いっぺんテレビで単理が単理多分英語の方が上手けどそれ英語です。それもI am a graduate student second year at the University of Texas at Austin. My mother is from Miyako-jima and I came here with my cousin. Yesterday, I went to Chibi-Chiri-gama and Shimuku-gama and learned about the ongoing grief and guilt that continues to separate communities that are tied in Yomitan today. One cave ended up committing mass suicide, and the other has many survivors. And because Uchinanchu community from Hawaii came to one cave to tell them that it is okay to survive. And so I then found myself with Dr. Ile Hobart, who was working to return Ibi from the Peabody Museum in Yale with the support of Halealoha, which is the museum I am learning with Eric Wada's support may also have Uchinanchu and Shimanchu bones. I also have an auntie who has supported working in returning ancestral bones from the Moses African cemetery up in Maryland. And it seems our ancestral bones and ancestral bones of our friends are spread across borders, militarized or otherwise. I am curious to hear your thoughts on bones and our ancestors building connections to return, as Okinawa faces a dual colonialism between Japan and the US, of which violence of the base in Hanoko being built on our ancestral bones, as Gushkin has done a lot of work on, and also similarities of violence that we face today across borders, such as PFAS. Where are you finding opportunities for collective liberation and solidarity, or yuimaru, between repatriation and ancestors guiding us towards solidarity? Or maybe what lessons can decolonial or anti-colonial returning of our ancestors teach us? And what does it mean to validate Shimanchu, Uchinanchu knowledges of ancestors in order to create hope in thinking of the future rather than the past?
今のご質問に対して、お答えになりたい方は、意見がある方はどうぞ。はい。
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. What we were referring to before is the opportunity to bring allies from all over the world to support descendant communities in insisting on repatriation. And this has to be bold thinking. Linking arms with other indigenous communities is absolutely critical. Finding space beyond that for allies, for people and organizations that can make your voices louder, make your rights more apparent, make the people who resist you less comfortable. It seems critical that those voices be amplified.
Excuse me while I shade my eyes so I can see you. You've asked a very important question, and I think the first step has been Dr. Ota bringing us all together to talk about this, to creating this space where we can all talk frankly, and we can share ideas and experiences. This is where it grows. It has been started already by each of the communities that we've talked with. But the challenge now is, how do you work with the people on this stage, because they're allies, both within Okinawa and Japan, but also across the globe, in Hawaii and other places like that. Remember these faces and names. Remember their email addresses. They also have networks that you can engage with. And the ideal would be for all of us to step out and all of you to step in and continue that conversation, and to hold systems in power accountable to your voices.
私の司会の不手際でなかなかうまく進行ができませんでした。そろそろですね、この回も終盤に向かわせないとおそらくもう時間がなくなってしまうと思います。そこで、ここからはですね、九州大学の瀬口さんにまとめの言葉をお願いし、それから大阪大学名誉教授の池田さんにですね、短いコメントをお願いし、
申し訳ありません。手を挙げてくださった方々。
一言言いたいです。
はい、はい、はい、反対という
はい、最後数よ中がなびら。わんね、ユンタンザ生まれの宇佐美節子やいびん。安心中、いろんな話、父、自己、いるきさいびん。この今言ったことは、今日はたくさんの人からいろんなことを教えていただいて感謝です。で、私は読谷村生まれの宇佐美節子です。で、私が言いたいのはですね、先ほど具志堅さんが土に返すっていうことをおっしゃいました。私はキリスト教の牧師なんですが、人間は土から作られたって聖書にちゃんと書いてあります。ですから元の場所に遺骨は戻すべきっていうのが私の意見です。で、自分たちの祖先の慰霊を考えるべきは、先ほどアイヌの人々であり琉球人の私たちだと思います。ですから土に帰るべき人間の骨をですね、やたらなんていうか、博物館やいろんな場所に置いておくものではなくて、その骨が帰るべきところに返すのが私たち子孫の務めではないかなというふうに今日の皆さんのお話を聞いて思いました。以上です。
クリスチャン文化にある人はこの祖先崇拝とかについてはどう思いますか？クリスチャンはこれ死んだら普通に動けないでしょ。
すいません、私の不手際です。そろそろもう時間がなくなってきました。
西洋文化はクリスチャニティの文化は死んだ祖先に対してはどういう考えを持ってますか？
ちょっともう時間がですね押してしまってごめんなさい、私の不手際です。ですから、またこの撤収作業を継続する中でですね、個別にお話しする時間もあると思います。申し訳ございません。ここで、一応ですね締めのお話をですね、伺って、この会をですね終わりの方に導きたいと思います。すいません、それでは九州大学の瀬口さん、お願いいたします。
はい、もう本当に人類学会はこの遺骨問題の解決策をですね全く考えずに先送りしてきました。本当に目の前にある問題の解決策を考えるのではなくて先送りしてるっていうのは日本政府と似たようなところがあると思います。で、歴史を反省するという行為がもうまず欠如しています。でも人類学という分野はもう残念ながら人種奴隷制を正当化するために生まれて、それに続き植民地主義を正当化するために発展した学問であることは否定できません。で、人種主義植民地主義を反省しなければ先へ進むことはできません。で、日本の人類学者は日本は欧米とは違うという言い回しを常に使いますが、日本の人類学はその人種主義を作り出したドイツの人類学をもとにして始まり、その後も欧米と同じように植民地主義政策に負の貢献を人類学者自身が自らの意思で関わって携わってきたのです。で、それをその時代だったから仕方がないとして日本において人類学という分野が過去の歴史を反省せず責任も取らず150年も経ってしまいました。反省しないから新たな人種主義、新たな植民地主義に手を染めていることに気がついていないんです。今日皆さんが報告されたように世界ではこの負の歴史を持った人類学という学問を変えていこうという方向に向かっています。そして沖縄、アイヌ、ハワイ、アメリカ先住民には彼らが欲する返還の方法があるのです。で、日本だけが取り残された末には人類学会の消滅です。現実を直視せず黙って待っていれば逃げられるとでも思っているのでしょうか。想像力がちょっと欠如していると思います。で、今の人類学会は次世代の研究者のために遺骨を保存しておかなければならないと言っていますが、次世代のためにはきちんと先人たちの過去の歴史的な行為と自分たちが持っている特権意識にも気づかず、社会とのつながりを拒否して自分たちが続けてしまっている新たな植民地主義を反省せず謝罪せず、信頼関係を完全に失ってしまっているもう今現在、これから数十年先は共同研究もできないと思います。 でまず返還謝罪、そして先住民の子孫のコミュニティと対話してより良い環境を作っていくことが優先だと思います。もう日本の人類学者はもう短くします日本の人類学者は本当に人類学で何ができるのか、何が明らかにできるのかということを全く説明してこなかったと思います。今日こちらの人類学者の方が説明してこられましたが、いや私も数年前に新聞記者の取材の時に人類学の研究で何が明らかになるのかということを説明した時に、その記者にそんなこと、いろんなことが分かるとは知りませんでした。自然人類学というのは日本人の起源を探る学問だとばかり思い込んでいましたと言われて、逆にショックを受けた次第です。でこのような研究をね、子孫のコミュニティと一緒にやってきた経験がないのです。何度も繰り返しますが、共同研究では子孫のコミュニティから出てくる疑問、それ研究目的、そういうものがもう最重要で、そのリサーチクエスチョンをもとに調査を進めていくこと、学者から一方的ではない双方からの教え合いをするべきなのです。でその研究結果は研究者だけが考えた一方的な研究結果よりずっと豊かな結果が出るのは、もうブレイキー先生たちが、アガワル先生たちがおっしゃっている通りです。このように、人間を探求する学問であるはずの人類学なのに、社会とのつながりをなくした人類学には未来がないと思います。で実はそういうふうに考えて憂いている若手の人類学者は結構います。でもしこれから人類学会の方向性が変わっていけば違う未来が開けるかもしれません。で若手と私たちとで人類学者が今とは違う未来を築くために支え合うアライを作って人類学会を変えていく可能性、それを今期待するとか考えております。どうもありがとうございました。
大阪大学の名誉教授の池田です。最後に、英語と、日本語で話させていただきます。On behalf of organizer, I will now give my closing remarks. There is a Ryukyuan proverb that says, if you do right thing, things will turn out the way they should. Maktu Soke Nankurnaisa. This symposium has held to promote the righteous act of returning human remains of all the world. I hope that this symposium has been an encouragement to all of you who are fighting daily and doing the righteous thing. 次に日本語です。琉球語にマクトゥーソーケナンクルナイサーという表現があるそうです。正しい行いをすると物事はあるべき結果に結びつくこととここでは理解しましょう。遺骨返還という正しい行いにはいくつかの困難があります。このシンポジウムはそのような困難を取り除くための試みの一つでした。このシンポジウムが日々困難に直面されている皆さんに問題解決のための何らかの助けになれば主催者一同これほどの喜びはありません。マクトゥソーケナンクルナイサニフェデービル失礼いたしました。ありがとうございました。
はい、池田さん、島言葉の挨拶ありがとうございました。今日私の一人でうまく進行ができませんでしたが、ここでですね、この会を、終えなければ、機材の撤収等々に時間がありません。本当に申し訳ありません。このような機会をですね、またいつか近いうちにですね、皆さんと持ってたら素晴らしいんではないかなと思っております。今日はご視聴の皆さんどうもありがとうございました。最後にご登壇いただいた皆様にですね、拍手をお送りしてこの会を終わりましょう。
お疲れ様です。ズームの皆さんもどうも。これであとはなんか
6時に関連提出しないと。
そうそう、ここからですよ。
映像とアイヌ文化と琉球文化は、アイヌ文化は水もないし、ハイアナキー外国とこの条約も交わしていくこともないし、そんなところでね、琉球文化とはちょっと違うみたいですか。だから、原生もそれ多いと思ったんだよね、原生も。
共通点だね。共通点。だから僕は本当になんと虐げられた。
そこはそうですよ。
いやだから条約の信頼とか言って、それはだからじゃあ琉球新聞の力をね強調するだけですね。それは
できるだけ協力しようと思うんだけど、
ギロメルさんはどちら？
日本戦してもね、アイヌ国の同一して使うものは、おそこに多いなという現状だったと思いますよ。
いや、これは我々自身が主張してですね、日本政府で国がね、
決められるから、選挙に動くというそういうことかなということです。
なるほど、ありがとうございました。
すいません。ですね、レシーバー、お話でも結構なんですけど、レシーバーを先にお返しください。番号を確認して、出た後にレシーバーがございますので、レシーバーをご返却ください。お願いします。レシーバーが完全に返却されないと、私たちは多大な罰金を課せられますので、どうかご協力をお願いします。
辻さん、あそこに行ってください、出口で。
いやいやいや。